Hello there, and welcome to Secretum Histories, where curiosity settles into a comfortable corner and the mysteries of the ancient world unfold at a pace meant to ease the mind rather than stir it. Tonight we're settling into a quiet idea, one that has lingered at the edge of human imagination for a very long time. Many stories tell of powerful visitors who shaped early civilizations and then returned to the sky. But some traditions, some legends, and some curious fragments of old writing suggest something different. They imply that the ones believed to have departed may never have left at all. The thought doesn't arrive with drama or alarm. It settles in slowly, like the way an old photograph invites you to examine the details a little longer than you expected. If the Anunnaki didn't vanish into distant heavens, if they remained somewhere on this world, quietly and steadily, it would shift the way we think about the past, and perhaps the way we think about the present. Before we explore the long path that led to this idea, I'd like you to pause for just a moment and recognize where you are, the hour you're in, the space you're resting in, the sense of being in this moment at the start of a slow and steady story. If you find this kind of gentle exploration soothing or simply a comfortable way to unwind, it would mean a great deal if you chose to like this video or subscribe. It helps this calm corner of the internet reach others who might be searching for a quiet place to think. And now, if you're settled, we can begin moving toward the idea that the Anunnaki never actually left Earth. An idea that unfolds not with dramatic leaps, but with small, steady steps. When people speak about the Anunnaki, they often begin with the oldest stories from Mesopotamia. These stories describe a group of figures tied to the foundations of civilization. Figures associated with knowledge, structure, agriculture, law, celestial order, and the early attempts to understand the forces shaping human life. In most retellings, these beings arrived from afar, interacted with early humans, and eventually departed. The departure is presented as a clean break, as if a door closed and was never opened again. But the ancient world rarely gives such simple endings. Myths shift, merge, and reinterpret themselves across centuries. They add layers rather than subtract them. They incorporate new details as cultures evolve. And in that shifting landscape of stories, certain threads suggest continuity rather than departure. Instead of a grand exit, there are hints of endurance. Many ancient texts describe presences that lingered, not in the obvious ways we might envision, but through ongoing contact, indirect guidance, and the continuation of particular roles within society. These presences are not described as distant or unreachable. They are placed in mountains, deep places, temples, or regions described as sacred or hidden. The tone of these descriptions never quite matches a farewell. They are written as though the writers assume these figures were still very much present, only less visible. This difference in tone is where the idea begins to take shape. If a story describes a departure, it tends to emphasize distance, absence, or a final act. These texts do not behave that way. They fade into the background rather than ending. They change from active scenes to quieter ones. What makes this idea even more complex is that different civilizations inheriting or interacting with Mesopotamian traditions created their own interpretations. They carried certain names, symbols, and functions into new chapters of history. When a culture absorbs stories from another, it usually reshapes them to fit its worldview. But some elements survive unchanged. Certain figures associated with judgment, writing, knowledge, and celestial cycles appear in distant regions separated by geography, language, and culture. The recurrence raises a subtle thought. Perhaps these stories endured because the figures behind them never fully disappeared from the cultural memory. They may have remained woven into human life in ways that didn't rely on visible appearance or physical presence. Instead, they existed through influence, teaching, or continuity of knowledge. When the idea is explored more closely, people often imagine a literal scenario. They picture physical beings moving through ancient cities, leaving behind technology or structures. But this story grows easier to consider when the concept becomes less literal and more grounded in the steady, practical ways civilizations evolve. If individuals or groups with advanced understanding remained on Earth, their presence might not resemble the dramatic scenes found in modern storytelling. It might look more like mentorship, more like a long, quiet process of guiding societies as they learn to stand on their own. In such a scenario, the departure would never have occurred, because there would have been nothing to depart from. The world itself would have been their home for far longer than any written memory can reach. This line of thinking becomes even more steady when considering how ancient societies described knowledge. Many civilizations treated knowledge as something given, not discovered. Techniques in agriculture, astronomy, mathematics, and metalworking are often attributed to teachers described as older, wiser, and already present when humans were still learning to cultivate land or track the skies. These teachers are not portrayed as gods in the modern sense. They are portrayed as beings who understood more, lived differently, and came from a time before human cities. Some stories even describe them as having families, social structures, or responsibilities that continued long after their first appearance. This continuity suggests persistence rather than disappearance. Another aspect often mentioned is the way certain ancient sites were treated. People built temples, monuments, and cities on locations believed to be connected to these early visitors. But the purpose wasn't always worship. Sometimes it appears to have been maintenance, as if these places were created to sustain long-standing relationships, or to preserve knowledge exchanges that were still expected to occur. Structures aligned with solstices, equinoxes, or star paths may not simply reflect astronomical interest. They may reflect instructions or traditions passed down by individuals who understood celestial movements long before those societies had the mathematical foundation to calculate them. If those individuals remained nearby, helping civilizations grow slowly over time, it would explain why later cultures developed advanced calendars or architectural precision long before similar advances appeared elsewhere. As we follow these details, the idea that the Anunnaki never left Earth gains a kind of calm stability. It doesn't require imagining a hidden world or a secret underground civilization. It simply requires noticing how ancient texts refuse to close the door on these figures. They change the way they are described. They reduce the scale of their appearances. They shift from direct involvement to indirect influence. But they do not erase them. Instead, they place them deeper into the background, as though time encouraged them to become more reserved rather than vanish. In many traditions, figures associated with teaching or guidance eventually retreat from public roles. They remain only for the ones prepared to seek them out or understand their teachings. This pattern appears across cultures. The earlier stories describe active interactions. Later stories describe selective ones. Eventually the presence becomes something only a few individuals understand or carry forward. When these patterns are compared, they create a picture of quiet continuation. They do not resemble an ending. Even in the archaeological record there are intriguing patterns. Technologies sometimes appear abruptly, with no clear developmental pathway. Then they stabilize, spread, and become part of daily life. When this happens once, it can be attributed to innovation. When it happens repeatedly across different regions and time periods, it suggests a different type of influence, a series of steady introductions rather than sudden bursts. If a group with advanced knowledge remained present over long spans of time, introducing concepts at intervals, these patterns would make sense. They would not need to reveal themselves openly. They would simply interact, advise, or demonstrate when needed. This also aligns with how many ancient societies viewed the relationship between humans and divine beings. The relationship wasn't framed as worshipping distant deities. It was framed as receiving guidance from older beings who participated in early civilization building. This interaction was presented as practical, not mystical. The beings understood agriculture, irrigation, astronomy, metallurgy, and law. They taught these concepts as if teaching were part of their responsibility. Then, gradually, they stepped back as societies became more self-sufficient. This stepping back is often mistaken for departure, but the original texts do not describe physical withdrawal. They describe a change in involvement. When looking at later eras, the presence of these figures becomes more subtle. They appear in stories about advisors to kings, guardians of sacred places, or teachers who arrive unexpectedly with advanced knowledge. Sometimes they are described as travellers with unusual longevity, unusual skills, or unusual understanding. These descriptions are sparse, but they maintain continuity with the earlier accounts. The tone is consistent. The roles are familiar. The shape of the story doesn't shift dramatically. It simply becomes quieter. Over time, as societies changed, the language took on new forms. Names shifted. Titles changed. The old figures were absorbed into regional gods, spirits, sages, or ancestors. The stories became symbolic rather than literal, but the underlying idea remained. Someone had been present for a very long time, someone not quite like humans, someone whose influence did not end when early cities rose. They remained participants in the background of human history. The shift from literal beings to symbolic representations can make the original idea harder to detect, but when the layers are peeled back, the through line persists. If the Anunnaki never left, the form of their presence would not be obvious. It wouldn't involve grand displays or unmistakable demonstrations. It would be quiet. It would follow the steady rhythm of civilizations growing, learning, and eventually moving beyond the need for direct instruction. In this way, the idea gains a certain grounded quality. It doesn't claim hidden miracles or secret rulers. It suggests a long-term coexistence, a gradual change in roles, and a presence that adapted as humans developed their own systems of knowledge. As this story continues, we will walk through these ideas one step at a time. We will explore the possibility that the ones believed to have departed may have simply shifted into a quieter form of existence. We will consider the ways ancient peoples preserved memories of teachers who never truly went away, and we will follow the traces that appear in languages, symbols, and structures across the world, moving from the more visible past toward the more subtle present, allowing the idea to unfold without haste. For much of recorded history, people have spoken about the moment when the Anunnaki supposedly left the world behind. The tale appears in countless retellings, often given a sense of closure, as if an ancient relationship between humans and their early teachers reached a clean and decisive end. In these versions, the world watches these figures rise toward the heavens, leaving humanity to develop on its own. But when the oldest sources are studied more carefully, it becomes clear that the idea of a definitive departure is far less certain than later storytellers made it seem. Many early accounts present a shift rather than an exit, a change in activity rather than a disappearance. The ones who are said to have walked away may not have done so in the way people now imagine. Instead, the descriptions resemble a quiet withdrawal from public life, something more like stepping behind the scenes instead of leaving the stage. The earliest Mesopotamian writings do not describe a dramatic separation between humans and these early figures. The stories often place them in specific cities, temples, or regions associated with knowledge, order, or authority. Their movements are described with practicality, not wonder. They oversee activities, assign roles, teach skills, and guide building projects. As time progresses, the descriptions simply become less direct. Their presence does not vanish, it shifts to a different mode. They appear in fewer scenes, but the narrative still assumes they exist somewhere, fulfilling responsibilities not always visible to the people writing these texts. This subtle continuation forms the foundation of the possibility that they did not walk away, but rather relocated to a quieter, more selective role in human affairs. As cultures evolved and new traditions arose, the original stories were reshaped to reflect changing beliefs and needs. Over time, the Anunnaki began to take on the roles of distant gods rather than active participants. But this transformation is part of cultural adaptation, not necessarily a reflection of the historical reality behind the stories. When societies grow, they reinterpret their origins in ways that help them navigate their present circumstances. A teacher from the past may gradually become an ancestor, then a deity, then a symbol. The figure's original place in history becomes obscured, not because the figure left, but because the culture needed a new way to describe its connection to the past. The moment described as the departure in many modern retellings appears to come more from mythic compression than literal storytelling. Ancient chroniclers often summarize long periods by assigning symbolic meaning to transitions. A change in leadership might be described as a divine withdrawal. A shift in the relationship between the rulers and the priesthood might be framed as the gods returning to the heavens. These descriptions served a social purpose. They explained why old arrangements no longer applied. They justified new political structures. They reinforced the idea that humans were now responsible for their own choices. In this context, the idea of the Anunnaki walking away begins to resemble a narrative tool rather than a historical statement. Archaeological patterns also raise questions about the notion of a complete departure. The development of human civilization does not show an abrupt decline in knowledge or capability at any particular moment. Instead, there is a gradual and consistent accumulation of skills. This continuity is unusual in a story where a group of advanced teachers supposedly vanished. If they had truly left, one might expect a measurable collapse or sudden loss of technical understanding. Yet the evidence shows the opposite. Irrigation systems continued to improve. Astronomical calculations grew more refined. Architectural techniques became increasingly sophisticated. Writing systems evolved rather than fractured. These patterns suggest an ongoing influence, or at least a long-lasting foundation, laid by individuals who continue to support or guide societies in ways not recorded in explicit terms. There are also accounts from other regions far removed from Mesopotamia that describe beings with similar characteristics appearing long after the supposed departure. These accounts do not claim to be part of the same tradition, yet they contain parallels too consistent to ignore. They speak of figures with extensive knowledge, unusual longevity, and an understanding of natural forces that outpaced the surrounding civilizations. Some traditions describe these beings arriving from distant lands. Others insist they had already been present since ancient times. Still others place them in remote regions, away from major population centers, where they interacted only with select individuals or groups. These stories do not describe a return. They describe a continuation. The consistency of these portrayals across different cultures suggests that the idea of the Anunnaki walking away may be less reliable than once assumed. Instead of a departure, it may reflect a gradual shift toward isolation, privacy, or selective involvement. If a group of advanced beings found humanity ready to function independently, they may have chosen to reduce their visibility. This choice would not require leaving the planet. It would simply require relocating to areas where human contact was less frequent, or where their activities could continue without drawing constant attention. Many ancient references mention mountains, remote valleys, or deep underground spaces as places associated with the continued presence of such beings. These descriptions are often interpreted symbolically, but their recurring placement in inaccessible regions suggests a more literal meaning. Another element supporting the possibility of continued presence lies in the way ancient texts describe communication between early rulers and these older beings. Many accounts mention messengers, emissaries, or envoys who travelled between human settlements and the dwellings of the Anunnaki. These visits continued well after the supposed departure date. The descriptions are matter of fact, treating these journeys as normal rather than extraordinary. There is no indication that the writers believed they were communicating with beings who lived in the heavens. Instead, they described travelling to regions that were simply difficult for ordinary people to reach. The idea of beings living in the sky appears to develop later, perhaps as a metaphorical way to express distance, authority, or superiority rather than literal celestial residence. Some scholars have noted that the shift from terrestrial presence to celestial association follows a common pattern in mythological development. When a figure or group becomes less visible over time, later generations reinterpret their absence by placing them in the heavens. This does not imply that the figures moved there. It reflects the way memory adapts when direct experiences fade. If the original beings withdrew to remote places and no longer interacted openly, later storytellers may have concluded that they left entirely. Over centuries, this interpretation solidified into the idea of departure, yet the earliest stories do not describe such an event. They describe a gradual reduction in visibility rather than a definitive exit. There is also the matter of technological anomalies that appeared in ancient societies long after the supposed departure. Certain structures, artifacts, and engineering feats emerged suddenly, without clear developmental stages leading up to them. These advancements appear to come from outside the established knowledge base of the society in question. If the Anunnaki had truly left, such sudden developments would be difficult to explain. But if they remained in selective contact with certain groups, offering guidance or demonstrating techniques at specific moments, these anomalies would make more sense. They would represent isolated interactions rather than broad cultural transformations. Some traditions in the ancient world actually state quite plainly that the old teachers did not leave but simply moved away from human settlements. These accounts describe the beings as preferring isolation once human society reached a certain level of stability. They are depicted as retreating into regions considered sacred or forbidden. These places were often protected by strict rules or rituals that discouraged casual visitation. The idea was not that the beings were unreachable, but that only certain individuals were permitted to seek them out. This structure mirrors the way mentorship often evolves over time. When a student becomes more capable, the teacher steps back while still remaining available when needed. The image of the Anunnaki walking away shifts significantly under this lens. Rather than imagining a dramatic departure, one begins to see a long process of redefining boundaries. The beings may have assessed the state of human society and determined that continued open involvement was no longer necessary. They may have chosen to allow humanity to grow without constant oversight, stepping in only when challenges arose that required their understanding. This approach would allow them to remain connected to the world without dominating it. It would represent an intentional strategy rather than abandonment. In various legends, there are references to individuals who encountered beings of great age and knowledge in remote locations. These encounters are often brief, described with a tone of practicality rather than awe. The individuals report learning specific techniques, receiving advice, or being guided through difficult circumstances. There is no implication that these beings came from another world. They are described as living in seclusion, maintaining traditions or knowledge that the surrounding society had lost or never possessed. These stories produce a picture of continuity rather than rupture. If the Anunnaki had remained near human civilization, but gradually restricted their interactions, their presence would naturally fade from the historical record. People tend to document events that involve large groups or public displays. Quiet guidance offered to a single person would not produce elaborate inscriptions or monumental art. It would be remembered only in lineage stories, oral traditions, or symbolic references. Over time, those references would blur. The beings themselves would become figures of mythology, but the original presence might still persist in the background, unseen but not non-existent. This perspective also aligns with the way many ancient societies treated certain knowledge as sacred. Techniques in astronomy, medicine, and engineering were often restricted to priesthoods, initiated groups, or specialized castes. These custodians of knowledge sometimes claim to receive instruction from older beings or hidden teachers. The claims are usually interpreted metaphorically, but if the ones who walked away never left, then these structures may represent formalized systems for maintaining contact or preserving teachings. The idea gains further stability when studying stories about great transitions in human history. Many cultures describe periods where older beings withdrew from direct involvement but continue to watch the unfolding events from a distance. Their departure was never absolute. It was a shift in posture. They remained observers, stepping in only when circumstances required intervention. This interpretation does not rely on supernatural assumptions. It simply recognizes that a group with advanced understanding might choose to limit its engagement once humanity reached a certain stage of development. The picture that emerges is quiet but consistent. The beings once described as active participants in early civilization did not vanish. They changed their approach. Human societies growing more complex would no longer need constant oversight. Instead of rulers or builders, the beings became watchers, teachers or advisors who interacted selectively. This gradual change would be mistaken as a departure by later generations unaware of the original continuity. As this narrative continues, it becomes easier to imagine how their presence could remain unnoticed in the modern world. Remote regions still exist. Knowledge can be preserved in ways that leave little trace. Interactions can occur without producing records. What appears to be absence may simply be discretion shaped by long experience. And as we move into the next part, the quiet traces they may have left behind take on a clearer form, offering a steady continuation of the story without disrupting the calm path we have established so far. Across the world, there are places where the past seems unusually persistent, not through mystery or supernatural claims, but through the simple and steady way certain structures hold on to patterns older than the civilizations built around them. These places do not speak in voices or signals. They hold their memory in stone, in alignments, in measurements carved into their foundations. They behave as if something important once occurred there, something that did not end when new cultures rose on top of the old ones. When the idea of the Anunnaki remaining on Earth is considered, these sites become important. They present themselves not as static ruins, but as locations embedded with traces of an earlier presence, traces that resist being forgotten. The oldest Mesopotamian cities demonstrate this continuity clearly. Their foundations sit atop older layers, not merely because rebuilding is practical, but because the locations held long-standing importance. Eridu, one of the earliest known urban settlements, was rebuilt so many times that its layers form a kind of geological record of human activity. But the site's significance did not weaken as centuries passed. Successive cultures treated it as a place of origin, not in a symbolic way, but in a literal one. They believed the earliest teachers lived or worked there, leaving behind structures meant to be preserved rather than replaced. The rebuilding was not simply architectural. It was an act of maintaining contact with something that had once been present. The temples in these cities were constructed with meticulous attention to detail. Their angles, measurements, and orientations were not based solely on aesthetic preference. They reflected patterns that required knowledge of the sky and the movement of celestial bodies. These patterns appear in cultures that supposedly had limited mathematical capacity during their earliest phases, yet the structures remain aligned with precision. This suggests that the knowledge used to design them originated from individuals who understood far more than the societies constructing them. These buildings were not passive monuments. They were tools, observatories, and sometimes meeting places where specific activities occurred. If the Anunnaki had remained on Earth, these sites may have served as locations where interactions continued, even as public involvement gradually decreased. In later millennia, new cities rose across other regions, many of which show remarkable similarity in design. Stone platforms, terraces, and ziggurat-like structures appear in places separated by vast distances. The similarities are too consistent to attribute solely to coincidence. They indicate shared principles or shared origins. Some scholars interpret these similarities as expressions of a common cultural impulse. But when considering the possibility that early teachers remained on Earth, these recurring patterns look more like the continuation of methods passed down through selective instruction. The structures may have served the same purposes across regions, to mark locations where early interactions occurred, or to maintain knowledge that would be used by future generations. Throughout the ancient world, there are also regions where the local population insisted that certain mountains, valleys, or plateaus were not ordinary. These places were described as the homes of older beings, not in a mythological sense, but in the same way people describe a remote village as the home of someone who prefers privacy. The descriptions are matter of fact, not exaggerated. They speak of physical presence, not distant divinity. These sites were often restricted, with access controlled by rituals or customs. Such restrictions may have functioned as boundaries, limiting interactions to those who are prepared or permitted to approach. Over time, when the beings became less visible, these boundaries remained, preserved by tradition even after their original purpose was forgotten. One example is found in the mountainous region surrounding ancient Mesopotamia. Many stories describe individuals travelling into these mountains to seek guidance or instruction from older beings who lived away from urban areas. These accounts do not treat the journey as a symbolic act. They present it as a practical necessity. The messenger or ruler travels to a specific location, receives information, and returns. The place is described with consistent physical characteristics, difficult to access, surrounded by natural barriers, yet built with structures that served clear functions. These locations, though remote, were not abandoned. They were active in ways unrelated to ordinary human settlement. If the Anunnaki had chosen seclusion rather than departure, such places would have provided the privacy and stability they needed. Outside Mesopotamia, there are sites whose construction techniques present challenges when explained solely through the abilities of the surrounding civilizations. Massive stones, cut with precision beyond common regional tools, appear in multiple regions. Their placements show knowledge of engineering principles that would not develop widely until much later. The consistency of these features across continents suggests instruction from individuals who had long-standing familiarity with advanced methods. If the beings remained on Earth, they may have shared knowledge at intervals, helping different societies solve similar problems while limiting the scope of what each society received. This pattern would explain both the similarities and the differences between early architectural achievements in regions separated by distance. These stone structures are not uniform, they reflect variations in style and purpose, but regardless of region, they often mark locations with long-term significance. In many cases, later cultures built directly atop earlier structures without altering the original orientation. This suggests they did not fully understand the purpose of the older buildings yet respected their importance. The choice to preserve orientation implies that the sites themselves carried long-standing meaning. These places acted as anchors in the human landscape, points where the past remained tangible and necessary. They preserve the echoes of interactions that began long before later civilizations reached their full complexity. Some of these locations include underground chambers, tunnels, or rooms unreachable without considerable effort. These spaces were not designed for large gatherings or public rituals. They appear intended for small numbers of individuals. Their precision and isolation make them distinct from ordinary storage or shelter constructions. In certain traditions, these spaces were described as areas where meetings occurred between early rulers and older beings. The descriptions use straightforward language. They do not rely on metaphors or symbolic references. The chambers were places of instruction or negotiation, not places of worship. Their existence strengthens the idea that certain beings remained accessible, but preferred limited contact. These spaces functioned as secure meeting points long after the original interactions faded from public life. In the Americas, there are ancient sites aligned with astronomical cycles, with accuracy that rivals later observatories. These alignments appear in places where the surrounding societies had no documented mathematical frameworks capable of producing such results. The consistency across different sites suggests a knowledge base not derived from local experimentation. It suggests a shared instruction given by individuals who understood celestial mechanics thoroughly. If groups remained on Earth who possessed deeper knowledge, They may have introduced these principles to multiple regions without revealing their full understanding. The stone structures used for these observations stand as reminders of the teaching that occurred there. They refuse to be interpreted as mere artistic achievements. Their purpose is clear through their alignments and placements. In Africa, ancient structures such as stone circles and carved monoliths show a similar pattern. They record movements of the sun, moon, and stars with methods requiring consistent calibration. The local populations preserved the sites for centuries, often without altering the original designs. Oral traditions state that the knowledge behind the constructions came from older beings who lived nearby. The descriptions treat these beings as physical individuals with practical needs, not distant or symbolic entities. Even after the beings became less visible, the sites remained central to cultural memory. They acted as reminders of lessons once received. Across Asia, certain cave complexes and mountain shrines carry stories of long-lived teachers who resided in these places for generations. The descriptions present them as beings who didn't age normally and possessed knowledge that exceeded the surrounding culture. Their presence did not involve spectacle. They lived quietly, interacted selectively, and preserved traditions that influenced the development of the region. These sites often contain carvings or inscriptions that reflect understanding beyond the recorded knowledge of the era. Their isolation would have provided the privacy required for beings who preferred to limit their contact with the broader population. The structures in these regions remained stable and central to local tradition long after the original inhabitants disappeared from view. In Europe, ancient megalithic sites demonstrate alignments and engineering choices that mirror structures in distant parts of the world. These choices cannot be attributed to shared cultural exchange, given the distances and timelines involved. Instead, they indicate that the builders received similar forms of guidance. They were taught methods that left behind enduring markers. Even when later cultures reused these sites for different purposes, the original alignments and features remained intact. These features were not removed because they were too deeply embedded in the structure, both physically and conceptually. They reflect the earliest phase of construction, a phase often attributed to older beings in local tradition. As the story continues, these places form a map of influence. Not a literal map of hidden settlements, but a pattern showing where interactions may have taken place. The distribution is not random. The sites appear in regions where early civilizations developed rapidly. They appear in places associated with breakthroughs in agriculture, architecture, astronomy, and governance. Their presence supports the idea that beings with advanced understanding remained in contact with humanity during formative periods. They taught selectively, choosing locations suitable for instruction. The stone structures left behind bear the imprint of this deliberate approach. They store the echoes of these interactions in their layout and craftsmanship. Another important feature of these sites is their durability. Many ancient structures built solely by human societies did not survive due to environmental wear or structural limitations. Yet the sites associated with early teachers were constructed with methods that ensured longevity. Large stones were fitted with precision that resisted erosion and shifting. Foundations were oriented to avoid stress from seasonal changes. Drainage systems were built into the structures to protect them from flooding. These techniques were far ahead of widespread architectural knowledge for most of human history. Their continued survival demonstrates that the builders understood how to create structures meant to outlast multiple civilizations. If the beings remained on Earth for long periods, they would have needed stable places to store knowledge or maintain activities. These sites provided that stability. In many cultures, certain stones were treated with particular respect, not as divine objects, but as components of something older. People believed they had purposes no longer understood. These beliefs were not based on superstition alone. They were shaped by the constant presence of structures that defied ordinary explanation. Even when the original meaning faded, the physical form kept the memory alive. The structures encouraged preservation because they commanded attention through their design. They carried the imprint of their creators long after direct involvement ended. Some researchers studying ancient architecture have pointed out that the earliest layers of certain sites demonstrate techniques superior to the later ones built on top of them. This inversion challenges the idea of linear progress. It suggests that the oldest builders possessed knowledge that later generations lost. If the Anunnaki remained on Earth but reduced their involvement over time, this pattern would emerge naturally. The first structures would reflect direct guidance. The later ones would reflect attempts to imitate methods no longer fully understood. The stones themselves display this transition clearly. They document the shift from precision to approximation. These places also create continuity across cultures that never met. A site in Mesopotamia shares characteristics with one in the Andes. A structure in the Mediterranean resembles one in the Pacific. Such similarities cannot be explained solely through trade or migration. They indicate shared knowledge introduced at intervals across the world. If the beings remained and travelled or communicated with select groups, these shared patterns would emerge without the civilizations needing to interact with one another. The presence of underground structures adds another dimension to this pattern. Many ancient sites include chambers, tunnels, or passageways hidden beneath the surface. These spaces were designed with care. They were not random excavations. Their construction required understanding of ventilation, stability, and long-term preservation. Some appear to have served as storage areas. Others resemble meeting chambers. Still others show signs of advanced acoustics. These features imply that the creators intended these spaces to be used for activities requiring seclusion and control. If the beings remained on Earth but chose limited contact, underground structures would allow for privacy and protection. Their placement beneath major sites suggests integration rather than separation. They were part of a larger system. When examining these patterns, the idea that early teachers walked away becomes less credible. Instead, the structures indicate ongoing presence. Not open, not central, but persistent. The stones behave like records of interactions spread across centuries. They maintain orientation, alignment, and form long after the names of the builders have faded. They refuse to allow the memory of their origins to disappear. They are not loud reminders, they are steady ones. As we move forward into the next part, these lasting imprints begin to shape a clearer picture of how the world could preserve the presence of beings who chose to withdraw from prominence without abandoning their connection to humanity. Across the ancient world, people built their earliest understandings of existence by watching the sky. They observed patterns not out of curiosity alone, but because the sky carried a stability that the landscapes around them often lacked. Storms came and went, rivers shifted, harvests changed year by year, but the movements above remained steady. These movements created a framework for time, agriculture, ritual, and social order. When early societies wrote about the beings they believed shaped their worlds, the sky was the place they associated with origin, authority, and continuity. It became the backdrop for every story about beginnings. As the idea of the Anunnaki remaining on Earth takes shape, the sky serves as a quiet witness to their continuing presence, not as a place they departed to, but as a constant companion to the life unfolding below. The earliest astronomers were not scientists in the modern sense. They were observers who noticed connections between the heavens and life on the ground. Their calculations tracked the rising and setting of stars, the phases of the moon, the shifting of seasons, and the slow, deliberate movement of planets across the celestial sphere. These patterns were turned into calendars, predictions, and rituals. But they also served another purpose. They formed a stable language that allowed people to communicate ideas about origins without losing meaning across generations. The sky could be read by anyone, regardless of culture or background. It held information that did not erode with time. If early teachers remained on Earth, the sky would have provided a natural tool for them to use. It was the one shared reference that matched the scale of their knowledge. Many ancient texts describe the Anunnaki in relation to specific stars or planets. These associations are often interpreted as mythic symbolism, but a closer look reveals that the descriptions behave more like instructions. They identify celestial markers that would help people align structures, track seasons, or understand the cycles that govern their environment. The beings connected to these markers were not said to dwell in the sky. They were said to understand it. They used its stability to teach principles that early societies needed. In this sense, the sky did not represent their home. It represented their method. It allowed them to store knowledge in a place that required no preservation effort. Once a group learned how to read the sky, the information remained accessible as long as the sky itself remained unchanged. As human societies developed their first observatories, the precision built into these structures reveals a deeper level of instruction than commonly assumed. Alignments with solstices, equinoxes, and heliacal risings of specific stars required consistent measurement over long periods. The effort involved suggests that people learned these methods from individuals who already possessed mastery of celestial cycles. If the Anunnaki taught humans how to track these movements, the sky would have served as a stable classroom. Every observation reinforced lessons that could be applied to agriculture, navigation, or governance. A group choosing to withdraw from public life could still maintain influence through the knowledge they left behind, since the sky itself would continue to display the same patterns reliably. Many ancient cities were oriented toward particular points on the horizon. Their streets, temples, and ceremonial spaces lined up with sunrise or sunset on significant dates. These orientations are too consistent across different regions to be accidental. They indicate a shared approach to grounding urban life in celestial cycles. If the beings who taught early humans remained on Earth, they may have helped design these alignments, not as monuments to themselves, but as tools that allowed societies to synchronize daily activities with larger natural rhythms. Over time, the reasons behind the alignments faded from common understanding, but the structures continued to preserve the original knowledge. The sky plays another role in this story. It provides a timeline that appears in every culture's attempt to record its own history. Ancient peoples believed their earliest ancestors watched the same stars they did, even when thousands of years separated them. This continuity created the sense that humanity's early teachers remained close, not in a physical sense, but in the shared experience of viewing the heavens. People did not look upward expecting to see beings living among the stars. They looked upward to align themselves with cycles that the early teachers emphasized. The sky was a silent reminder of lessons that did not need to be retaught, because they repeated automatically. In many traditions, the beings who guided early civilizations are described as becoming less visible over time. Their withdrawal coincides with the growing ability of societies to read and interpret celestial patterns independently. This shift mirrors the relationship between a teacher and a student who no longer requires direct guidance. The teacher does not leave the building entirely. They simply step back, allowing the student to apply what they have learned. In this sense, the sky becomes evidence of a long transition. It shows that the beings did not depart suddenly. They allowed their presence to fade gradually as humanity developed confidence in its own understanding. The way ancient societies organized their calendars further reflects this transition. Early calendars were complex systems that required careful observation. They balanced lunar and solar cycles, accounted for irregularities, and linked festivals or agricultural activities to specific celestial events. This level of complexity suggests that the people who developed these systems possessed knowledge beyond ordinary cultural experience. If the Anunnaki remained on Earth while reducing their involvement, the development of calendars demonstrates a shift from direct instruction to independent practice. The sky served as the reference manual that ensured the lessons remained consistent even as human societies changed. Over time, the sky became a canvas where people placed their memories of the early teachers. They named stars or constellations after beings who influenced their cultures. These names did not imply literal residence. Instead, they served as reminders. The constellations provided a way to preserve stories without writing, since their patterns remained stable across generations. If the beings no longer interacted openly, the stories attached to these constellations acted as markers. They kept the memory alive in a consistent, universally accessible format. The stars themselves became a quiet archive of interactions. Some ancient myths describe a time when the sky was closer than it is now. These descriptions often confuse modern readers, but when examined carefully, they do not refer to physical proximity. They refer to a period when interpreting celestial patterns felt easier because the beings who understood them were present to explain their significance. Once the beings stepped back, the sky seemed more distant. The knowledge was still available, but the interpretation became the responsibility of humans alone. This change may have created the impression that the beings left, when in reality they simply reduced their visibility. In many regions, the earliest astronomical records demonstrate a level of accuracy difficult to explain through independent experimentation. Angular measurements, predictions of eclipses, and calculations of planetary cycles appear long before the mathematical tools needed to derive them. These achievements imply instruction from individuals who had spent far more time studying celestial mechanics than any early society could have managed alone. If the Anunnaki remained on Earth, they may have introduced these insights directly, allowing civilizations to accelerate their development. Once the methods were understood, the beings could withdraw without disrupting the continuity of knowledge, because the sky itself reinforced the lessons. As societies matured, they built observatories that functioned not as sacred sites, but as practical tools. These observatories were used to measure time, track agricultural cycles, and coordinate public events. Their operation required a structured understanding of the celestial sphere. If early teachers withdrew, these structures acted as anchors that preserved the knowledge they had shared. The sky continued to provide the data needed to maintain societal order, even without direct involvement from the beings who first explained the patterns. The connection between sky and governance also reveals traces of earlier involvement. Many ancient rulers traced their authority to celestial symbolism. They aligned their reigns with specific stars or planets. They used astronomical events to justify decisions or mark transitions. This practice suggests that early rulers inherited a system in which celestial cycles played a central role in leadership. If the Anunnaki guided early societies, they may have used celestial markers to teach rulers how to time major decisions. Once the rulers understood the system, the beings could step back. The sky provided ongoing reinforcement of the principles without requiring repeated instruction. In some regions, traditions describe individuals travelling to remote places to learn about the sky from beings who lived apart from society. These beings were described not as gods, but as knowledgeable individuals who possessed unusual longevity. The stories explain that the lessons they offered were precise, practical, and directly tied to celestial observations. These accounts do not portray the sky as a distant realm. They present it as a field of study that required patient instruction. If these beings were part of the group that once guided humanity, their continued presence in remote locations would explain why certain lineages retained advanced astronomical knowledge long after the supposed departure. The sky also served as a record of change. Over long periods, precession gradually shifts the position of stars relative to the horizon. This slow movement allowed societies to measure the passage of centuries. Early civilizations understood precession far earlier than expected. They used it to calibrate their calendars and adjust ceremonial dates. Such understanding implies long-term observation across many generations. If groups remained on Earth who had observed precession for far longer than early societies, they could have provided this insight directly. The sky would then become a timeline that reflected the scale of their experience. When the beings gradually reduced their involvement, the sky preserved the continuity needed for societies to maintain the systems established earlier. The stars did not teach on their own, but they repeated predictable patterns that required no reinforcement. This stability made it possible for the beings to remain unseen without allowing knowledge to decay. The sky acted as a reliable partner in instruction, allowing students to continue learning long after the teacher stepped back. In some traditions, the beings are described as monitoring events from high places. These descriptions are sometimes interpreted symbolically, but when considered in a grounded way, they may simply refer to elevated locations that provided unobstructed views of the sky. Mountains, plateaus, and cliffs offer excellent vantage points for studying celestial patterns. If the beings chose remote areas for seclusion, they would naturally select places with broad views. Their continued study of the sky would ensure that their knowledge remained relevant. These elevated locations would allow them to remain connected to the rhythm of the world, while limiting interactions with human populations. The sky also provided a way for the beings to blend into the background of human understanding. People grew accustomed to looking upward for guidance. They used the stars as reference points for everything from agricultural planning to navigation. This reliance reduced the need for direct instruction. The beings could remain present on Earth without drawing attention. The knowledge they imparted would continue functioning automatically. The sky allowed them to maintain influence without requiring visibility. As centuries passed, societies built myths that described the sky as the realm from which the beings came. These myths developed not because the beings departed to the heavens, but because the sky had become so central to the memory of their instruction that it seemed logical to associate their origin with it. The misunderstanding grew naturally from the long gap between the earliest interactions and the later retellings. Without direct experience of the beings, later generations interpreted the stories symbolically. They concluded that the beings must have returned to the sky. The sky's stability reinforced this belief because it provided a constant presence that seemed separate from the changing world below. When viewed alongside the possibility that the Anunnaki never left Earth, the sky becomes not their destination, but their companion. It watched quietly as they shifted from open involvement to selective interaction. It held their lessons in patterns that could not be erased by time. It remained present in every era, allowing societies to continue applying knowledge long after direct contact diminished. The sky preserved memory without requiring explanation. It became the silent framework around which the rest of the story could develop. As we move onward, the focus shifts toward the human stories that grew from this ongoing presence. The myths that behaved less like imagination and more like recollection begin to reveal how the teachings continued even as the teachers retreated from sight. Across civilizations, stories about beginnings rarely behave like inventions. They carry a tone that feels closer to recollection than imagination. The details repeat with a steadiness that suggests people were not creating characters from thin air, but preserving accounts that had already been old by the time they were first written. Myths tend to grow in fluid directions, shifting to match the needs of the culture retelling them. Yet the earlier stories about the beings who guided humanity show an unusual consistency. They do not wander far from their central descriptions. They do not vary in the ways expected of tales passed across generations. They behave with the steadiness of memories, shaped over long spans yet anchored to core events that societies felt obligated to preserve. In Mesopotamia, the earliest tablets describing the Anunnaki present the beings with roles that are highly specific. Their functions are organized, clearly defined, and rooted in practical responsibilities. Some oversee knowledge, some agriculture, some law, some celestial measurement. The organization resembles an administrative structure rather than a pantheon created to explain natural forces. The clarity of these roles stands out because early mythology in many cultures tends to describe deities with broad, shifting domains, but the Anunnaki appear in the texts as if they were real individuals whose responsibilities were remembered, not imagined. This creates the sense that the stories grew not from speculation, but from recollected interactions. The tone of these myths is another indicator of their origin. Many ancient stories include dramatic events, exaggerations, or transformations intended to entertain or instill awe. But the earliest references to the Anunnaki rarely follow this pattern. They describe the beings performing tasks such as organising canals, assigning duties, determining calendars, and advising early leaders. The texts present these activities without embellishment. They read more like administrative records than mythological creation. This grounded tone suggests that the writers were preserving knowledge of real actions, carried out by individuals whose presence shaped the functioning of their society. As centuries passed, these early stories were absorbed into more layered mythologies. Later writers reinterpreted the beings through symbolic or religious frameworks. The practical roles evolved into divine ones. The older texts, however, remain distinct. They show a depth of detail inconsistent with invented mythology. They refer to locations, procedures, and sequences of events with specificity that indicates direct memory. This type of consistency across early versions of the stories implies a source more stable than creative interpretation. Other cultures far from Mesopotamia present stories with similar patterns. The beings they describe differ in name, but share characteristics that align closely with the original accounts. They appear as individuals with advanced knowledge, long lifespans, and practical involvement in early human development. The consistency across distant regions suggests that these stories did not arise independently. They reflect a shared memory that spread either through direct contact or through experiences that multiple societies interpreted similarly. When considering the possibility that the beings remained on Earth and interacted with different cultures, these overlaps begin to appear less mysterious. In many regions, myths describe visitors who arrived during early settlement phases, offered guidance, and then gradually withdrew. These beings are described in a matter-of-fact tone, not as supernatural entities performing miracles, but as individuals whose presence brought organisation and knowledge. The stories often specify that the beings taught early people how to build, farm, navigate, or record information. The nature of these lessons is practical, not mythical. They resemble instruction rather than divine intervention. This consistency suggests that the stories originated from direct experiences that were later transformed into myth. Some traditions describe these beings as tall, long-lived, or possessing an unusual calmness that set them apart from ordinary humans. These traits are not exaggerated into magical abilities. They are described as physical characteristics observed by early societies. Over time, these descriptions became symbolic representations of wisdom or power, but the original texts present them plainly. This plainness indicates that the writers were preserving their observations rather than inventing fantastical qualities. In addition to physical descriptions, the stories often record specific behaviours that imply the beings lived among humans rather than appearing sporadically. They are described as attending meetings, providing instructions, overseeing projects, or evaluating the progress of early settlements. These activities are not associated with distant gods. They reflect the behaviour of individuals maintaining involvement in developing societies. If the beings remained on Earth long after their initial appearance, these stories would naturally behave like memories of those interactions. Certain myths describe the beings withdrawing gradually rather than abruptly. The withdrawal is portrayed as a reduction in visibility rather than an ascent into the heavens. The beings stop participating in public events. They appear only to select individuals. They move into remote areas. These details align with the idea that the beings did not actually leave but chose to step back as human societies grew more independent. Over time, the memories of these transitions became mythologized into stories of divine departure. Yet the original accounts describe a process that appears grounded in physical reality. Some traditions record interactions between early rulers and these beings that involve negotiations, instructions, or consultations. The tone of these stories does not resemble worship. It resembles diplomacy or mentorship. The ruler approaches the beings with respect but not fear. The beings respond with guidance rather than displays of supernatural power. This dynamic suggests a relationship based on hierarchy and knowledge rather than divinity. These stories behave like recollections of administrative interactions, not mythic tales of divine intervention. In multiple cultures, the beings are associated with teaching early humans about laws and governance. They provide frameworks for organizing society, assigning roles, and resolving disputes. These teachings are described as structured and consistent. They show an understanding of long-term social stability that exceeded the capabilities of early human societies. The myths preserve these lessons as foundational, not symbolic. They treat the beings as responsible for establishing systems that continued functioning long after the beings became less visible. Such continuity implies that the beings remained present during the early implementation of these systems, ensuring that they took root successfully. The way myths handle chronology also reveals their memory-like quality. Many stories describe long periods in which the beings interacted with humans consistently. They do not compress these interactions into brief appearances. They portray the beings as present across generations, living long enough to see the outcomes of their teachings. This longevity becomes symbolic in later versions, but the original stories present it as simple fact. This presentation suggests that early societies observed individuals whose lifespans exceeded their own, leading to myths that preserve these observations in remembered form. Another feature found in these myths is the presence of direct quotes or dialogues attributed to the beings. These lines are presented as instructions, warnings, or explanations. They are not poetic speeches or ritualistic proclamations. They read like practical advice. Some texts record detailed explanations about agriculture, building techniques, or astronomical cycles. These lines behave like transcriptions of real conversations, preserved through repeated oral retelling before being written down. If the beings remained on Earth and taught early societies directly, these dialogues would be remnants of those interactions. In many cultures, stories of beings from earlier times become mixed with legends of ancestors or semi-mythical kings. Over generations, distinctions blur, but careful examination of the earliest layers reveals that the beings described are not portrayed as ancestors. They are portrayed as external figures with knowledge unknown to the societies they guided. The societies treat them as teachers, not progenitors. This distinction suggests that the stories did not originate from attempts to explain lineage, but from attempts to preserve interactions with individuals seen as fundamentally different from ordinary humans. Some myths contain references to tools, devices, or structures associated with the beings. These items are described with specificity and function. They often resemble advanced instruments used for measurement or construction. Later interpretations turn these descriptions into metaphors, but the original accounts present them as ordinary parts of the being's activities. The specificity of these descriptions implies that the storytellers were remembering objects they had seen or had heard described by those who encountered them. These details behave like memories preserved through repeated storytelling. Other myths describe the beings retreating to specific places rather than leaving entirely. They are said to inhabit mountains, islands, or underground spaces. These locations are described with physical detail. They are associated with real geographical features. The stories note that access to these places was limited but possible for certain individuals. This pattern supports the idea that the beings continued to live in remote areas. Over time, as contact decreased, the stories evolved into myths of heavens or other realms, but the original geographic references remain embedded underneath the later symbolism. In some regions, myths describe the beings as returning at intervals to check on human development. These returns are portrayed calmly, without spectacle. The beings evaluate progress, offer guidance, then withdraw again. These cycles resemble oversight rather than divine visitation. If the beings remained on Earth, occasional interactions would be remembered by select groups and transformed into stories that maintained their structure even as generations passed. A significant aspect of these myths is their resistance to reinterpretation. Many ancient stories shift dramatically over time, influenced by cultural changes or new religious developments. But the stories about early teachers remain structurally stable. They retain the same core details, even as they acquire new symbolic layers. This stability suggests that the underlying memories were strong enough to resist creative modification. Societies recognize the importance of preserving these stories accurately, even when new interpretations emerged. This behavior is consistent with the preservation of historical memory, rather than the evolution of imaginative myth. The consistency across continents further strengthens this perspective. Cultures separated by oceans tell stories of early visitors who brought knowledge, lived among humans, taught skills, and withdrew gradually. These stories share structural elements despite vast differences in language and tradition. Such consistency cannot easily be explained by coincidence. It reflects a shared source, either through direct interactions with the same group of beings or through memories preserved by societies that inherited knowledge from earlier civilizations. If the Anunnaki or similar groups remained on Earth, interacting with different regions at different times, these stories would show exactly this pattern of global similarity. Another important feature is the practical nature of the lessons attributed to the beings. Myths often emphasize moral or spiritual teachings, but these stories focus on agriculture, construction, astronomy, medicine, writing, and governance. These topics reflect direct contributions to societal development. They do not suggest abstract guidance. They suggest applied knowledge. When myths preserve such details with precision, they behave like records of real instruction rather than symbolic allegories. In some traditions, the beings are also described as debating among themselves about the level of involvement they should maintain. These debates resemble discussions among individuals with differing opinions rather than the actions of supernatural entities. The stories present disagreements, compromises, and changes in policy. This level of interpersonal detail is unusual for myth. It suggests that the storytellers were preserving memories of real conflicts or differing approaches among the beings who influenced early societies. As myths expanded across generations, later storytellers added layers of interpretation. They turned practical instructions into divine commandments. They transformed long-lived teachers into immortal gods. They elevated the beings from physical presence to celestial origin. But beneath these later additions, the core details remain grounded in the kinds of experiences that societies would remember if individuals with advanced knowledge had lived among them for extended periods. Even the stories about the beings withdrawing into silence retain a practical tone. They do not describe the beings ascending into the sky. They describe them moving into remote locations, restricting contact, or communicating only with certain individuals. These stories behave like memories of gradual separation, not departures into unreachable realms. Over time, the absence of direct contact encouraged symbolic reinterpretation. But the foundational details still point to physical presence rather than supernatural disappearance. Myths that behave like memories often preserve the emotional tone of the original interactions. In these stories, the tone is not fear or awe. It is respect, stability, and continuity. The beings are portrayed as steady influences, calm and knowledgeable. This tone suggests that societies remembered them not as unpredictable forces, but as consistent presences. If the beings remained on Earth long after their open involvement ended, the tone of these myths would naturally reflect the memory of quiet interactions rather than dramatic interventions. Taken together, the behaviours of these myths form a pattern that aligns with the possibility that the beings never left. They preserve practical details, consistent roles, steady interactions, and gradual withdrawal. They describe individuals whose presence shaped early societies in ways that later generations struggled to reinterpret. These stories behave like memories stored in narrative form. They continue carrying traces of experiences that may have originated from real encounters. As this narrative moves forward, the focus shifts toward the knowledge associated with these beings. particularly the kinds of tools and techniques they may have left behind. These traces begin to reveal how their presence continued shaping human development, even after they stepped out of view. Throughout the earliest layers of human history, there are objects, structures, and techniques that do not match the developmental stage of the societies that produced them. They appear suddenly, with no earlier prototypes. They function with precision that should have required centuries of experimentation. They stand firm in environments that should have eroded them long ago. When examined closely, these technological traces behave less like inventions and more like inheritances. They seem to reflect instruction rather than discovery. If the beings often described in early myths remained on Earth while stepping away from public life, these technologies would be among the clearest markers of their continuing presence. They reveal understanding far ahead of the societies using them, yet they do not appear with the spectacle one might expect from advanced visitors. They appear quietly, woven into the fabric of daily life, as if introduced in measured steps by individuals who valued stability over transformation. In Mesopotamia, some of the earliest tools and devices suggest a deeper knowledge of materials than the surrounding culture should have possessed. Early metalwork appears with a level of consistency that indicates prior mastery. Smelting techniques show understanding of temperatures, ventilation, and alloy composition that should have taken generations to refine. The people using these methods recorded them in practical terms, as if they had been taught directly rather than discovering them through trial and error. The smoothness of the progression suggests instruction delivered in a controlled way, with new techniques introduced when societies were ready to apply them. If the beings remained among humans while reducing open contact, sharing technology gradually would have allowed them to guide development without overwhelming it. Architectural methods present another form of technology that appears prematurely advanced. Some of the earliest large-scale constructions show precision that should not have been achievable with the available tools. The alignment of structures with cardinal directions, solstices, or particular star paths suggests knowledge of geometry and surveying that goes far beyond the simple observational techniques often attributed to early societies. The stones were shaped with precision that would require advanced understanding of leverage, angle, and weight distribution. The early builders left no records explaining how they achieved such accuracy. Instead, the structures themselves carry the imprint of techniques taught by individuals who already understood the principles fully. If the beings were present, these constructions could have been collaborative works carried out under their guidance. Another example arises in the creation of early irrigation systems. The canals, levees, and reservoirs built in ancient Mesopotamia required a level of hydrological knowledge that surpasses the typical abilities of agrarian communities in their earlier stages. These systems did not emerge gradually. They appear in the historical record fully functional, with careful calculations regarding water flow, seasonal variation, and agricultural demand. Maintaining such systems required ongoing oversight and adjustments. If the beings remained nearby, they could have provided the knowledge necessary to implement the designs. Their instruction would have allowed early societies to stabilize their food production far earlier than expected. In other regions, the use of megalithic stones reflects a method of construction that does not align with the technological capabilities of the societies using them. Stones weighing many tons were transported over long distances and fitted into precise arrangements. The accuracy with which these stones were placed suggests knowledge of mechanical advantage and structural load distribution comparable to much later engineering practices. The builders did not leave behind crude early attempts. The first efforts were already advanced. This indicates that the knowledge was introduced from a source already familiar with the methods. If the beings remained on Earth, they may have shared techniques selectively, allowing communities to construct durable structures that would preserve memory long after direct contact diminished. The presence of ancient astronomical devices and calculations further supports the idea. Some societies produced detailed calendars, accurate predictions of celestial events, and records of planetary cycles long before they developed writing systems complex enough to support such calculations. The precision of these records implies instruction rather than discovery. Observing the sky alone would not produce such detailed knowledge without a mathematical framework. If individuals with advanced understanding of the celestial mechanics remained on Earth, they could have introduced these principles gradually. The sky would have reinforced the lessons, allowing societies to maintain the knowledge even after direct instruction ended. Certain artifacts also demonstrate machining techniques that appear inconsistent with early technology. Smooth drill holes, precise grooved markings, and uniform cuts appear in stonework across multiple ancient cultures. These features suggest tools capable of consistent rotation, pressure control, and material removal. The tools required to produce these effects would not have existed in the societies that created the artifacts. This inconsistency implies that the methods were taught by individuals who already understood the techniques. Over time, the tools may have been lost or degraded, leaving only the artifacts as evidence of the advanced instruction. Metallurgical anomalies appear in multiple regions. Some ancient cultures produced alloys that require precise proportions and controlled heating environments. Bronze, for example, appears suddenly with a uniform composition across different regions, suggesting a shared source of knowledge. The complexity of the process makes it unlikely that multiple societies discovered it independently. If the beings who guided early civilization remained on Earth, they could have introduced metalworking practices at different times and places, ensuring that societies developed tools capable of supporting growth while maintaining control over the spread of more advanced techniques. The development of early writing systems also reflects advanced planning. The structure of cuneiform, for example, appears too organized to have emerged spontaneously. It behaves like a system designed by individuals with experience in recording information. The early tablets often deal with measurements, inventory, and administration. These practical uses suggest that writing was introduced as a tool for managing the structures the beings helped establish. If they remained present, they may have taught the earlier scribes how to record data accurately. The rapid stabilization of writing systems across different regions aligns with the idea that the knowledge was introduced intentionally, rather than discovered gradually. In some regions, stone vessels and pottery appear with surfaces polished so finely that modern analysis suggests techniques similar to lathe work. Such smoothness requires consistent rotational motion, which ancient societies supposedly did not possess. Yet the vessels exist, their symmetry exact, their interiors flawless. These items reflect methods taught by individuals who understood advanced shaping techniques. If the beings lived among early humans, they may have demonstrated how to create these objects without revealing the full extent of their technological capabilities. The construction of early bridges and roadways also reflects technology beyond what early societies should have mastered. Some ancient roadways were built with layered foundations, drainage systems, and surface treatments that prevented erosion and allowed for long-term stability. These features resemble later engineering practices. The presence of such designs in early periods suggests instruction from individuals with advanced understanding of material science and structural behavior. If the beings remained on Earth, they would have known how to plan infrastructure that could withstand environmental challenges. In Egypt, Peru, and parts of Asia, cutting and joining techniques appear that resemble methods for creating interlocking joints. These joints allowed large stones to fit together so precisely that no mortar was required. The shapes were complex, involving multiple planes and angles. Creating such joints demands advanced spatial reasoning and precise tools. These methods are unlikely to have been discovered independently across different regions. The consistency of their use suggests that societies were taught by individuals who already understood the techniques well. Some artifacts contain residue of materials that require controlled chemical processes. Certain pigments remained vibrant for thousands of years due to sophisticated mixing techniques. Metal surfaces were treated with compounds that prevented corrosion. These practices reflect understanding of chemical reactions that early societies should not have possessed. If the beings remained nearby, they could have introduced these techniques in contexts where they served practical purposes. such as preserving structures or enhancing tools. In multiple regions, artifacts associated with measurement appear prematurely advanced. Early rulers used standardized weights and measures long before societies fully developed systems of trade that would require such consistency. These standards suggest instruction from individuals who understood the importance of precise measurement for maintaining stable societal structures. The early appearance of standardized weights across distant regions implies a shared source. If the beings remained on Earth, they may have introduced systems of measurement to facilitate governance and trade. Some archaeological findings include remnants of tools made from materials that do not align with the technological level of the surrounding culture. While the tools themselves may be worn or incomplete, their shapes suggest more advanced designs than those known to have been used in the period. These tools may have been introduced by beings who already understood how to craft them. Their presence in archaeological context reflects the introduction of technology not invented locally. In oral traditions, stories describe devices used by the beings that allowed them to shape stone, measure distances, or observe celestial events with ease. These stories are often later interpreted symbolically, but the original versions present the devices plainly. They describe their functions directly. These details behave like memories of tools that early humans saw but did not understand fully. Over time, the memory of the tools became merged with mythic elements, but the core description remained. As societies grew, some of these advanced techniques became part of daily life, while others faded. The techniques that aligned with natural development paths persisted. The ones that required sustained instruction or advanced tools eventually disappeared. This uneven preservation creates patterns in the archaeological record that appear inconsistent. Some structures show high precision. Others built centuries later appear less advanced. This inversion suggests that the knowledge to create the earlier structures came from a source no longer available by the time later builders attempted to replicate them. If the beings remained on Earth, but gradually withdrew from teaching roles, the knowledge they introduced early on would slowly degrade as societies tried to maintain the techniques on their own. In some regions, traditions describe hidden or withdrawn communities said to preserve advanced knowledge. These communities rarely interact with wider society, yet they maintain practices that appear older and more refined than surrounding cultures. While modern interpretations often categorize these stories as folklore, the stability of the accounts across generations suggests preservation of real memory. These traditions may reflect the continued presence of individuals, or descendants of individuals, who once shared advanced knowledge openly, but later chose seclusion. When studying ancient technology, one recurring pattern becomes evident. The earliest examples of certain techniques are often the most advanced. Over time, the techniques become simpler or less precise. This contradicts the expected pattern of gradual improvement. Instead, it reflects a model where knowledge was introduced at a high level, then adapted by societies with limited understanding. Without continuous instruction, the techniques became less refined. This pattern aligns closely with the idea that the beings existed alongside early humans but stepped away gradually, leaving humanity to preserve what it could. Across the world, early technological achievements appear as isolated sparks. They illuminate brief periods when societies demonstrated capabilities far beyond their developmental stage. These sparks fade, reappear in distant regions, and sometimes vanish entirely. If the beings moved between regions, interacting with selected groups while avoiding widespread involvement, these scattered achievements would represent the points where teaching took place. The remnants of advanced technology would become markers of their presence, left behind not as deliberate monuments, but as tools for improving human society. As we continue forward, the narrative shifts to the people who lived near these beings, the ones who passed down stories and maintained traditions shaped by interactions that occurred quietly, steadily, and without spectacle. The stories preserved in human communities begin to reveal how the being's presence influenced cultural development long after they retreated from view. When examining the rise of the world's earliest cities, there is a pattern that emerges quietly yet persistently across continents. Some settlements grow at a normal pace, shaped by the slow accumulation of skills, population and trade. Others appear to leap ahead of their surroundings, developing systems of organisation, engineering and resource management that seem out of proportion to the societies producing them. These cities do not grow from nothing. They expand around older structures, older traditions and older influences that behave as though a guiding presence once helped shape them. If the beings remembered in early myth remained on Earth, withdrawing from open involvement but continuing to influence development indirectly, these cities would be among the clearest markers of their lingering presence. They show signs of growth shaped by knowledge that did not arise from local experimentation alone. They reveal traces of instruction left behind by individuals whose understanding surpassed the era in which they lived. One of the earliest examples is Eridu, often recognized as one of the first true cities in human history. Its layers reveal a development pattern unlike typical settlements. Instead of gradual expansion, Eridu shows repeated rebuilding on the same sacred spot, each phase more structured than the last. The earliest levels already display organization, suggesting that the site was important before the surrounding community reached the scale required to sustain such complexity. This implies that the original influence came not from population growth, but from the presence of individuals who understood how a settlement could function efficiently. The later phases carry echoes of early guidance, with temple structures and communal layouts that seem to reflect planning beyond what the local population was prepared to design independently. Uruk, another early city, demonstrates a similar leap. Its rapid growth defies the slow developmental arc usually expected for early urbanization. The construction of massive walls, precincts and specialized districts in such an early period suggests access to knowledge not yet widespread. The organization of labor, distribution of resources and coordination of architectural projects require oversight and technical understanding that early societies typically lack. The city's core structure seems to rise from a foundation shaped by instruction rather than experimentation. If beings with extensive knowledge lived among humans during these early phases, their influence would naturally be woven into the city's growth. They would not need to rule openly. Their presence alone, combined with guidance offered at key moments, could shape the development of a settlement into a sophisticated urban centre. In Egypt, the early cities show a similar pattern of sudden coherence. Settlements along the Nile grew in alignment with agricultural cycles that required advanced irrigation management. The earliest forms of Nile-based agriculture appear fully formed, as though introduced by individuals who already understood how to control water systems. The cities that emerged along the river show a high degree of planning, with streets and districts that reflect organized thinking. This organization implies that the people constructing the city were either taught by individuals with engineering experience or were following instructions passed down from earlier generations. If the beings remained present in remote areas, offering guidance on irrigation, measurement or planning, their influence would appear in the early city grids long before written records describe such capabilities. Beyond the Middle East, cities in the Indus Valley also demonstrate development that surpasses expectations. Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro show alignment, drainage systems, standardized weights, and consistent architectural layouts that appear more advanced than many later cities. The uniformity across these settlements suggests centralized knowledge rather than scattered experimentation. The water management systems in particular reveal an understanding of flow, filtration, and structural stability that would require significant instruction. These cities appear to grow around a core of knowledge that behaves like a preserved inheritance. If the beings interacted selectively with the Indus Valley populations, providing instruction as needed, the city's advanced features would be the natural result of such guidance. In Anatolia, the ancient site of Çatalhöyük presents a different type of pattern. The settlement lacks streets, with houses built closely together in a honeycomb-like formation. The architectural coherence suggests communication at a level beyond casual collaboration. People constructed homes in a coordinated way, reflecting shared principles that might have originated from earlier instruction. The decorated rooms, symbolic arrangements, and consistent building methods may reflect influence from individuals who brought unfamiliar practices into the community. While later interpretations view the site as a cultural anomaly, examining it in the context of beings who remained on Earth provides another perspective. The settlement's remarkable uniformity could reflect a design introduced early on by teachers who withdrew once the community learned to maintain the methods independently. Across the world in South America, early urban centres show similar leaps. The city of Caral in Peru emerges suddenly with monumental architecture, sunken plazas, and complex layouts that appear without earlier prototypes. The people of Caral constructed large-scale buildings during a period when most societies relied on small settlements. This disparity suggests knowledge introduced from an external source, not necessarily from abroad, but from individuals living nearby who possessed experience with large-scale construction. If the beings remained on Earth and occasionally shared knowledge with isolated groups, the sudden appearance of sophisticated cities would follow naturally. Carroll's growth reflects an underlying template, one that may have been provided by beings who understood how to shape a city in ways that supported stability and community cohesion. In the Andes, the cities that developed near Lake Titicaca, such as Tiwanaku, exhibit engineering capabilities beyond the expected level for their era. The precision of stonework, the alignment of structures, and the organization of urban spaces suggest teaching from individuals who understood how to design settlements that could withstand harsh environmental conditions. The city's layout appears to reflect astronomical and seasonal considerations. This level of planning implies that its designers possessed knowledge of the sky, of seasonal cycles, and of architectural durability. If beings lived in remote areas of the Andes, their influence could have shaped the early development of such cities. In China, early urban centres along the Yellow River Valley demonstrate organisation that suggests instruction rather than improvisation. The cities show attention to drainage, symmetry, and boundaries. Their early involvement with astronomical observation indicates a deep connection between planning and celestial cycles. These features reflect the same pattern seen in earlier civilizations elsewhere, settlements growing around knowledge that seems inherited rather than invented. If the beings interacted with early Chinese populations during their formative periods, the city's structured layouts and early astronomical systems would reflect their influence. Another notable feature of ancient cities is the uniformity of measurement systems within them. Standardized bricks appear in the Indus Valley. Standardized units appear in Mesopotamia. Standardized weights appear in multiple early civilizations. This standardization suggests centralized teaching. Societies do not typically arrive at consistent measurement systems without prolonged experimentation, yet many early cities show stability from their earliest phases. If the beings who once taught early humans remained nearby, they may have introduced measurement systems that allowed cities to develop coherent construction and trade. These systems would have supported stable growth, forming the backbone of urban development even after direct instruction decreased. The spatial placement of cities also deserves attention. Many early urban centres were built near regions that appear in myths as places where the beings lived or withdrew. These locations are described as mountains, valleys, or remote plateaus. The proximity of cities to such places suggests a relationship between settlement development and areas once associated with the being's presence. Cities may have been established near these areas to maintain access to guidance or oversight. As interactions diminished, the cities continued growing, but their roots remained linked to these older locations. The physical closeness may reflect a time when early humans built settlements near the regions where their teachers lived, ensuring that contact remained possible even as the beings preferred privacy. In some cultures, stories describe the beings overseeing the construction of the first cities. These accounts do not portray the beings engaging in labour themselves. Instead, they are described as providing instruction, allocating resources, or designing layouts. The tone of these stories does not resemble myth in the sense of supernatural spectacle. It resembles recollection of coordinated effort between knowledgeable beings and early human communities. Over time, the beings' involvement may have lessened as humans became more capable of maintaining the structures independently. But the stories remain as reminders of the city's origins, preserving memories of guidance that shaped its earliest phases. Many early cities developed central districts dedicated to administration, record-keeping and ceremonial functions. These districts often align with the oldest parts of the settlement, suggesting they were established first. The presence of these areas from the beginning implies that early planners understood the importance of organised management. They designed the cities not as organic clusters but as structured environments capable of supporting large populations. This foresight suggests teaching from individuals familiar with urban management. If the beings remained present, they may have helped establish these core districts, ensuring that the cities grew in stable, sustainable ways. The arrival of writing systems in these early cities also aligns with the idea of instruction from advanced beings. Writing appears first in administrative contexts, as a tool for managing resources and recording information. Its introduction corresponds with the growth of cities that required new forms of organisation. Writing does not emerge gradually. It appears fully structured, as if designed by individuals who knew exactly how to record information efficiently. This suggests that early scribes learned from teachers who understood the value of written records. The cities served as centres where this knowledge could be applied and maintained. Another indicator is the development of civic infrastructure. Early cities constructed drainage systems, waste management structures, and public spaces with a level of foresight unusual for their stage of development. These features reflect understanding of population density, health, and environmental conditions. Societies typically acquire such knowledge through trial and error, often after experiencing significant challenges. Yet many early cities show these features from their earliest layers. This implies that individuals with experience living in large settlements may have guided the planning. If the beings remained present, they could have introduced such knowledge before cities expanded, allowing communities to avoid problems that would otherwise arise. The organisation of labour within these cities also shows signs of external influence. Early societies that produced monumental architecture did so efficiently, coordinating workers in ways that require advanced planning. The scale of these projects suggests guidance from individuals familiar with large construction efforts. The cities do not reflect chaotic experimentation. They reflect coordinated action. This coordination aligns with the idea that beings with advanced knowledge provided instruction without taking over the work themselves. Their presence would have allowed early societies to achieve feats that would otherwise take centuries to refine. The distribution of specialised districts within these cities further supports this idea. Workshops, markets, housing areas, and ceremonial centres appear in organised patterns. These patterns resemble the layouts of later cities that benefited from extensive administrative experience. Their presence in early cities implies instruction from individuals who understood how urban environments functioned at scale. If the beings had lived in structured communities before interacting with humans, they would possess the knowledge needed to guide the development of early cities. Trade networks associated with these cities also show signs of advanced influence. Early societies developed long-distance trade routes far earlier than expected. These routes required knowledge of navigation, geography, and logistics. The presence of trade networks connecting distant regions suggests introduction of navigational techniques. If beings with extensive knowledge of the world remained on Earth, they may have taught early humans how to travel efficiently, allowing cities to grow through access to resources beyond their immediate surroundings. The cultural practices of early cities also contain echoes of these influences. Ceremonies tied to celestial cycles, Laws aligned with agricultural rhythms and rituals reflecting understanding of natural forces all suggest instruction from individuals who observe these patterns closely. The cities preserved these practices through generations, maintaining the memory of the beings who first emphasized them. Over time, the practical origins of these traditions became symbolic, but their structure continued reflecting the knowledge behind them. The most striking pattern across these early cities is the stability of their earliest phases. Cities typically grow chaotically, reshaping themselves as populations increase. But many of the world's earlier cities show stability in layout, purpose, and design. This stability suggests that the initial plans were effective and required little modification. Such effectiveness is unlikely to arise from early human experimentation alone. It suggests that the initial plans came from individuals with experience in urban design. If the beings remained on Earth long enough to guide these first phases, the stability of the cities would reflect their influence. As the narrative continues, the focus shifts from these organized spaces to the individuals who lived in them, the ones who preserved stories of the beings in more intimate ways. Their accounts provide a clearer sense of how the beings interacted with human societies even after withdrawing from public life. Across the vast landscape of ancient history, most people lived quiet lives unaware of the forces that shaped their world. They worked the land, kept families, built homes, and observed traditions without ever expecting to meet anyone extraordinary. But scattered throughout the earliest records are references to individuals who claimed to know beings unlike ordinary humans. Some served as intermediaries, some were apprentices, some were rulers whose authority came from interactions with older, wiser figures. Others were ordinary people whose lives changed because of encounters that shaped their communities for generations. Their accounts are not presented as wondrous or impossible events. They appear in records that treat them as practical matters, woven into the everyday functioning of society. These individuals form a thread linking early cities and advanced technologies to a quieter, more selective phase of involvement from the beings remembered in ancient stories. The earliest of these individuals were the priests and scribes of Mesopotamia. Their writings include descriptions of conversations with beings who provided instruction on agriculture, law, and astronomy. These accounts do not resemble spiritual visions. They describe direct interactions, often framed in administrative or practical contexts. A scribe receives information about celestial cycles. A priest is told how to organize a ritual. A leader is advised on how to manage water resources during a difficult season. The tone is steady and focused. The beings are not portrayed as distant gods speaking from unreachable heights. They are described as present entities whose knowledge could be accessed under specific conditions. If the beings still lived nearby, interacting only with select individuals, these scribes and priests would have been the ones chosen to maintain the communication. In some texts, the individuals who claim to know these beings are described as chosen, not because of divine selection, but because of temperament or skill. They were said to be calm, observant, or disciplined, traits that allowed them to understand the instructions given to them. These descriptions suggest that contact was not meant for everyone. It required a level of stability or maturity that would not overwhelm the recipient. The stories mentioned rigorous preparation, quiet environments, and structured approaches to learning. These methods resemble the way teachers introduce complex subjects to students capable of absorbing them. The beings did not seek worship. They sought individuals who could carry knowledge responsibly. Rulers also appear among those who claim direct contact. Early kings often justified their authority by referencing guidance from older beings. These references are not framed in the symbolic way later cultures use divine right. They function more like political credentials. A king who had received instruction from a knowledgeable being was considered capable of managing the complexities of early governance. These rulers did not describe grand divine encounters. They described receiving counsel on matters such as resource distribution, legal structure, and conflict resolution. Their legitimacy was tied not to supernatural approval, but to demonstrated access to superior knowledge. One example is the early Sumerian tradition of kingship being lowered from heaven. While later interpretations read this as a mythic statement, early texts frame it differently. They treat it as a formal transfer of responsibility guided by individuals who understood how leadership should function. The phrase "from heaven" may have originally referred to regions associated with the beings, rather than literal celestial origin. The ruler did not claim to ascend or descend physically. They claimed to have received guidance from those who carried the authority of long-standing tradition. The people who participated in these transfers often left records noting the presence of individuals unlike ordinary humans, described with characteristics that stood out not through spectacle, but through calm authority. Another category includes the builders and craftsmen who produced work far beyond the expected skill level of their time. Many of them attributed their abilities to instruction received from individuals they portrayed as older and wiser. These instructors were not described as spirits or deities. They were portrayed as tangible presences who appeared at specific times, offered guidance, and then withdrew. The craftspeople rarely embellished their accounts. They spoke of techniques, tools, and explanations. Their tone reflects the relationship between master and apprentice, not between worshipper and deity. This grounded tone strengthens the idea that they were recalling real interactions. Some traditions describe families who maintained knowledge passed down through generations, claiming ancestry not from gods, but from individuals who lived apart from society, yet visited on occasion. These families often held responsibilities related to astronomy, medicine, or law. They were seen as custodians of knowledge that did not originate within the surrounding culture. Their stories frequently include references to early teachers who lived in remote places. The descriptions emphasize physical features, speech patterns, and mannerisms that set the beings apart but do not portray them as supernatural. Instead, they resemble long-lived individuals who possessed stable, consistent behavior. In parts of the ancient world, certain healers claim to have been taught by beings who understood the body in ways far beyond local medical knowledge. These healers described methods involving precise treatments, herbal combinations, and observations of environmental factors. Their accounts often mention that the beings taught them not through magic, but through demonstration and explanation. The healers were chosen not for spiritual purity, but for attentiveness and willingness to learn. Their skills were practical, and the people around them saw the effects. Over time, the origins of their knowledge became mythologized, but the earlier stories preserve the grounded nature of the instruction. In the Americas, stories from the Andean region describe individuals who traveled into mountains and claimed to have met older beings living in seclusion. These individuals returned with new knowledge about agriculture, metallurgy, or construction. Their communities treated them not as prophets, but as students who had been taught by people with advanced understanding. The consistency of these accounts across different villages suggests that the stories originated from real experiences. The beings were described as calm, reserved, and focused on teaching rather than commanding. They appeared only when necessary and withdrew when their role was complete. Among indigenous peoples of North America, certain traditions speak of old teachers who visited periodically, offering knowledge about the land, the stars, and the cycles of nature. These visitors were not described in mystical terms. They were portrayed as travelers who arrived with purpose, shared knowledge, and then moved on. The people who interacted with them were often elders or individuals known for their wisdom. The stories maintain practical details such as clothing, speech, and manner. These details suggest that the beings were physical presences, not symbolic figures. If they remained on Earth but limited their interactions, they would naturally appear in the traditions of the individuals chosen to maintain ecological or astronomical knowledge. In East Asia, accounts exist of hermits, sages, or reclusive masters who are said to live far longer than ordinary humans. Stories describe individuals travelling into mountains seeking instruction from these long-lived teachers. While later traditions incorporate supernatural elements, the early accounts present the interactions as exchanges between knowledgeable beings and curious humans. The teachers were described with features that set them apart, such as unusual height, a calm demeanour, or an ageless quality. The individuals who met them did not portray the encounters as miraculous. They described them as fortunate opportunities to learn. If the beings who influenced early civilizations remained in remote areas, these stories would reflect the continuation of selective contact. In parts of Africa, oral traditions mention strangers who appeared in early times, offering knowledge about building techniques, farming, or governance. These strangers were described as taller, older, or more composed than ordinary people. They were said to avoid large gatherings, preferring to speak with only a few individuals. Their presence was viewed with respect but not fear. The individuals who met them often became leaders or advisors in their communities. The stories focus on the knowledge shared, not on supernatural qualities. This grounded tone aligns with memories of real interactions. In the Pacific Islands, certain navigators claim that their skills were taught by beings who understood the ocean in ways beyond ordinary experience. These beings were said to appear at night or in secluded areas, offering instruction on how to read stars, waves, and winds. The navigators described these lessons with precision, focusing on technique rather than myth. Their accounts resemble mentorship rather than divine revelation. If the beings lived in remote areas and interacted sporadically with seafaring populations, these stories would reflect those interactions. Throughout Europe, early legends describe individuals who met strangers possessing advanced knowledge, particularly in metallurgy, agriculture, or astronomy. These strangers were often described as foreign or unusually refined, not in a mystical sense, but in their manner of speech and understanding. The individuals who met them sometimes formed lineages that became associated with specialized crafts. Over time, these lineages were absorbed into mythic traditions, but the earliest accounts present the interactions plainly. The strangers instructed, observed, and then moved on. Their presence left a mark not through spectacle but through practical advancement. In many cultures, the individuals who claimed to know the beings occupied roles that required judgment, stability, or technical understanding. They were scribes, astronomers, healers, builders, or leaders. These roles require traits that align with the being's selective approach to interaction. A being with advanced knowledge would not choose a representative at random. They would seek individuals capable of understanding and preserving the knowledge. The stories of these individuals suggest that their selection was deliberate. A common element across these traditions is the tone of the encounters. The individuals do not describe overwhelming power or divine revelation. They describe quiet conversations, demonstrations, or guidance. The beings are patient, articulate, and focused on teaching. Their presence does not produce fear, it produces clarity. This consistency suggests that the stories preserve memories of real interactions rather than mythic projections. The individuals who claim to know the beings often face challenges when sharing their experiences. Their communities sometimes struggle to understand the source of the knowledge. As generations passed, the stories of the beings took on symbolic layers, but the core details remained grounded. The consistency of practical instruction across cultures supports the idea that the beings continued to interact selectively, even after withdrawing from public life. Some individuals describe their encounters as part of a lineage. They claim that their parents or grandparents had also interacted with the beings. These continuities suggest that the beings maintained relationships with specific families or groups. These families often became the custodians of knowledge, preserving traditions that appeared older than the surrounding culture. The presence of such lineages in multiple regions indicates long-term engagement between the beings and human communities. In some cases, the individuals who knew the beings were viewed with suspicion by their peers, not because they claimed supernatural experiences, but because their knowledge seemed unusual. This suspicion reflects the difficulty of integrating advanced instruction into societies still developing their own understanding. Over time, the individual's experiences were reframed as divine encounters to make them easier to accept. The being's teachings became legends, and the individuals became mythic figures. but the original accounts remain practical. There is another category of individuals, those who claim to have lived among the beings for periods of time. These accounts are rare but consistent in their details. They describe remote locations, stable communities, and routines that reflect advanced organization. The individuals reported learning mathematics, astronomy, or agriculture from the beings. They did not describe the communities as otherworldly. They described them as refined, efficient, and disciplined. These accounts suggest that some humans may have been integrated temporarily into the beings' secluded environments. As the beings became less visible, the individuals who knew them became bridges between the world of ordinary humans and the older presence living quietly on Earth. Their experiences preserved continuity even as direct interactions decreased. Through them, knowledge flowed from one era to the next. Their stories survive as traces of encounters that shape the development of entire civilizations. As the narrative moves forward, the attention shifts toward the possibility that the beings did not remain hidden entirely. Some traditions suggest that they lived among humans in subtle ways, blending into communities while maintaining their distinction quietly. The next part begins to explore what it might have looked like if they chose to remain in plain sight, influencing societies from within rather than from afar. Across the long history of human civilization, there is a persistent idea that the beings remembered in early stories did not entirely withdraw into remote places. Some traditions describe them living apart from ordinary populations, while others suggest a more subtle possibility. Instead of leaving the world behind or restricting themselves to inaccessible regions, they may have chosen to live among humans in ways that allowed them to observe, guide, and influence without drawing attention. The idea is not framed dramatically in the oldest accounts. It appears in simple references to strangers who seemed wiser than others, visitors who appeared with sudden insight, or individuals whose presence seemed quietly out of place. These stories do not describe supernatural beings hiding their nature. They describe individuals with unusual knowledge and calmness blending into communities, helping when necessary, and then stepping out of view before their presence stirred too much interest. If the beings never left Earth, blending in would have been a practical decision. Large populations eventually develop curiosity, suspicion, or conflict when confronted with difference. A being with an unusually long lifespan, extensive knowledge, or unfamiliar physical traits would attract attention in a growing society. As human communities expanded, maintaining open involvement would require constant explanation. Blending in would reduce the burden of visibility. It would allow the beings to stay connected while minimizing the misunderstandings that arise when ordinary societies interact with individuals who do not fit expected patterns. This does not require elaborate disguises or deception. It simply requires moving unobtrusively, choosing places where curiosity is low, and interacting at a level that does not reveal the full depth of their differences. Ancient stories often mention strangers arriving quietly, offering assistance or guidance and leaving before people fully understood their presence. These accounts appear in farming communities, coastal villages, mountain settlements, and early cities. The strangers were described as composed, articulate, and observant. They were not said to possess overwhelming power. Instead, they demonstrated patience and clarity. They helped communities solve problems related to agriculture, water management, construction, or medicine. They did not demand recognition or worship. They did not elevate themselves. They simply provided knowledge and moved on. If the beings chose to blend in, this pattern would reflect their approach, providing support without disrupting the natural development of the society. In regions where early cities grew rapidly, stories often mention individuals who appear to know more about engineering, administration, or astronomy than anyone else in the community. These individuals did not claim divine origins. They presented themselves as travelers or advisors. Their knowledge aligned with the advanced techniques appearing in the archaeological record. Over time, later storytellers transformed these individuals into culture heroes or deities. but the earliest references describe them as calm, quiet figures whose insight seemed out of place for the era. Their presence did not create spectacle. They acted as if their knowledge was simply a tool served to communities that needed help. If the beings integrated into human society selectively, this is what their presence would look like. Guidance without revelation. Some ancient texts describe people known for their unusual longevity. These individuals appear in genealogies with lifespans much longer than those around them. Later interpretations often treat these accounts symbolically, but the earliest lists sometimes separate these individuals from ordinary rulers or citizens. They are described as advisors, instructors, or observers rather than dominant figures. If a being lived far longer than humans, blending in would require limiting visibility. They would move periodically, shifting locations to avoid drawing attention to their longevity. Some traditions mention figures who appeared in multiple generations, offering guidance to rulers separated by long periods. These accounts do not describe mystical immortality. They describe the presence of individuals whose lifespan exceeded that of ordinary humans. Blending in would require subtlety, particularly in eras where genealogy was carefully recorded. In rural communities, stories persist of strangers who visited infrequently, but consistently across generations. These stories are not sensational. They are simple accounts of individuals who appeared the same over time, offering help during difficult periods such as drought, illness, or crop failure. The communities treated these visitors with respect, but did not consider them gods. The visitors did not ask for offerings or praise. They asked only that the knowledge be used responsibly. If the beings chose to blend in, these small interactions would form the backbone of their involvement. They could monitor the development of human society and intervene only when necessary, preserving stability while remaining largely unseen. Blending in would also allow the beings to avoid becoming objects of conflict. As societies expanded, leaders sought control, influence, or dominance. An openly different being could quickly become a target, a symbol, or a tool for political ambition. By living quietly and avoiding attention, they could guide without becoming entangled in human power struggles. Many traditions describe individuals who offered advice anonymously, providing rulers with solutions without revealing their identity. These advisors often appeared suddenly and departed before their presence became widely known. Such behaviour reflects a careful balance between involvement and discretion. It suggests that the individuals understood the risks of visibility and chose to maintain control over the level of attention they received. In some cases, blending in may not have required perfect imitation. Early societies were diverse. Travellers, merchants, and wanderers were common. A being with unfamiliar features could pass as a foreigner. Their knowledge would seem unusual, but not impossible. Many accounts describe strangers with refined manners, precise language, or unusual height being welcomed as travellers from distant lands. In societies accustomed to interacting with people from different regions, such differences would not cause alarm. Blending in would require only that the beings limited their display of unique traits and allowed assumptions to form naturally. Their appearance in stories as foreign sages, skilled craftsmen, or learned visitors fits this pattern. Some traditions describe entire groups of beings blending into society rather than individuals acting alone. These groups often lived in remote areas, but maintained occasional contact with nearby communities. They shared knowledge about agriculture, metallurgy, or navigation while preserving their privacy. The communities around them treated these groups with respect, acknowledging their wisdom without fully understanding their identity. Over generations, these groups became woven into local traditions as mysterious but benevolent neighbours. Their presence did not disrupt society, it enriched it quietly. This pattern aligns with the idea that the beings may have lived in clusters, maintaining their own way of life while interacting with humans only when necessary. Archaeological evidence sometimes hints at the presence of individuals or groups with knowledge beyond their surroundings. For example, in some early settlements, advanced structures appear alongside simpler ones, suggesting that only certain individuals understood how to construct them. This uneven distribution of knowledge implies selective instruction. If the beings lived among humans, they may have taught only specific people, ensuring that their knowledge did not spread too quickly or become misused. Blending in would allow them to guide development at a controlled pace, preserving stability while fostering growth. The concept of blending in extends to the social roles the beings might have assumed. They may have integrated themselves as healers, advisors, astronomers, or teachers. These roles require extensive knowledge and carry authority, but they do not require public power. Individuals in such positions could influence society significantly without revealing their origins. Ancient texts often describe teachers who lived on the outskirts of cities, visited occasionally by students seeking knowledge. These teachers were sometimes described as older than generations remembered, yet their presence was accepted. Their longevity was seen as a mark of wisdom rather than a sign of supernatural origin. If the beings adopted such roles, they could shape human development quietly and steadily. Another way the beings could blend in is through adopting temporary identities. They might remain in a location only long enough to teach, solve a problem, or guide a transition, then move on before people noticed inconsistencies. This would allow them to work across multiple regions over long periods without attracting attention. Some traditions describe travelling teachers or advisors who appeared in different places at intervals long enough not to reveal unusual longevity. These individuals possessed knowledge that seemed too advanced for their era, yet communities accepted them as wanderers passing through. Blending in would allow the beings to move freely without establishing permanent presence. The beings may also have blended into specific groups that maintained privacy. Some early societies included castes or guilds dedicated to specialized knowledge. These groups often existed at the margins of society, respected but not scrutinized. If the beings joined such groups, their advanced knowledge could be preserved without drawing widespread attention. Over time, the group's teachings would form the basis of local science, architecture, or medicine. The beings within these groups could remain relatively anonymous while still influencing societal development. In many regions, stories mention strangers who seemed unaffected by age. These figures appear in different generations without obvious change. Yet the communities around them did not interpret this as supernatural. They assumed the individuals were successors or relatives rather than the same person. If the beings experienced time differently, blending in would require moving between locations or allowing periods of separation. The stories that remain often hint at this movement. Strangers vanish for decades, then reappear with the same appearance and demeanour. Their return is seen as continuity rather than anomaly. The being's understanding of human perception would allow them to blend in by controlling the frequency and context of their interactions. Some accounts describe the beings blending into spiritual or religious roles without asserting divinity. They served as advisors to priests or sages, offering interpretations of celestial events or natural phenomena. Their involvement was limited, focused on ensuring that rituals remained aligned with natural cycles. Their guidance helped maintain societal balance without becoming the centre of worship. By working through existing structures, they could preserve knowledge while minimizing the risk of becoming objects of devotion or conflict. The beings may also have blended in by aligning themselves with emerging traditions. As societies evolved, new cultural narratives formed. The beings could fit themselves into these narratives without disrupting them. They could adopt local customs, languages, and practices, allowing them to move unnoticed through different communities. Their advanced knowledge would be interpreted as wisdom rather than a sign of difference. Over time, they would become respected but not questioned deeply. This quiet integration would allow them to observe human development closely while remaining unseen. Another subtle method of blending in involves mentoring individuals who would carry their knowledge forward. Instead of revealing themselves widely, the beings could choose a few people capable of absorbing and preserving their teachings. These students would then continue the work, spreading knowledge in ways that appeared human in origin. the beings themselves would fade into the background, leaving behind a lineage of thinkers, builders, and navigators whose skills reflected the original instruction. In this way, blending in becomes a matter of influence rather than presence. The beings become invisible not by disappearing but by allowing their work to be carried forward by humans. In some regions, ancient laws or customs refer to people who are outside the lineage or of unknown origin, but held positions of respect. These individuals appear in texts without explanation of their arrival. They possess authority derived from knowledge rather than birthright. Their presence suggests that communities accepted skilled outsiders without demanding full integration. If the beings placed some of their members into such roles, they could maintain subtle involvement in governance without revealing their origins. As centuries passed, blending in may have become easier as populations increased. In larger societies, individuals attract less attention. A being with a slightly unusual appearance or manner could move through a crowd without drawing notice. Urban environments would provide anonymity, allowing the beings to observe without scrutiny. Their involvement could shift from direct teaching to quiet observation, influencing only when necessary. Blending in does not require disguising every difference. It requires choosing the right situations, the right locations, and the right people. The beings would understand that visibility must be controlled to avoid misunderstanding. They would know how to present themselves in ways that matched human expectations, while reserving the full extent of their knowledge for those capable of receiving it. If they chose to remain on Earth, blending in would allow them to maintain the connection without assuming control or creating dependency. Throughout generations, the stories of the people who encountered these hidden presences form a mosaic of quiet influence. The beings appear in these stories not as distant gods, but as neighbours, teachers, travellers, or advisors. Their presence is subtle, consistent, and grounded in practicality. Their influence shapes societies without dominating them. They act as calm observers who intervene when needed and withdraw when stability returns. As the narrative continues, the next part turns toward the traces these beings left not in objects or cities, but in the languages, customs, and laws that endured long after their names faded. These traces reveal how deeply their presence became woven into human culture, even as their visibility diminished. Across the long arc of human civilization, countless physical structures have eroded, artifacts have fractured, and cities have fallen beneath layers of earth. Yet something persists even when stone and metal fade. Languages remember shapes of thought long after their speakers have been replaced. Legends drift forward through generations even when their details shift and blur. Laws preserve principles that outlast empires. These elements form a deeper archive than anything carved in stone. And when examined carefully, they contain traces of voices, teachings, and frameworks that do not align easily with the societies that first used them. If the beings remembered in early myths remained on Earth while stepping away from public involvement, it is within language, stories, and codes of behaviour that their most enduring influence would appear. These clues behave differently from ordinary cultural development. They preserve structures older than the civilizations that inherited them. They reveal patterns that suggest instruction rather than coincidence. Languages contain some of the clearest evidence of early contact. Many ancient tongues carry terms that appear fully formed in their earliest recorded stages. Words for measurement, celestial cycles, architectural forms, and legal concepts show no evolutionary trail. They arrive in the written record already refined, as if borrowed from a system older than the culture adopting them. Linguists often identify such terms as substrate vocabulary, meaning they originated from an unknown earlier language. The consistency of this phenomenon across regions suggests a common source of influence. If the beings shared certain concepts with early humans, the words describing those concepts would preserve their structure even after the beings withdrew. One example is the widespread appearance of number systems based on astronomical cycles. Some early societies used base 60, a structure far more complex than what would naturally develop from simple counting. The sophistication of this system, along with its early use in timekeeping, geometry and administration, suggests introduction rather than invention. A people just beginning to record transactions would not spontaneously create a numerical framework capable of supporting advanced calculations. It behaves like a borrowed system, taught by individuals who already understood its value. Over time, the practical uses of the system became integrated into daily life, but its origin remained buried within the foundation of the language. Another clue appears in the names of celestial bodies. Across multiple ancient cultures, the earliest names for planets, stars, and constellations carry meanings that reflect deeper knowledge than the surrounding society possessed. These names often describe positions, behaviours, or relationships in the sky that would require long-term observation. Yet the societies adopting the names sometimes lack the mathematical tools to derive such insights independently. The continuity of these names across unrelated cultures suggests a shared origin, dating back to a time when beings with extensive astronomical understanding taught early humans how to interpret the sky. Even after the beings reduced their involvement, the names endured. They became part of the language, preserving fragments of early instruction. Some languages also contain structural elements that do not align with expected developmental paths. Systems of classification, particularly those involving agriculture, medicine, or construction, appear fully organized from their earlier stages. These systems behave as though designed by individuals who already worked within complex frameworks. If the beings once lived among humans and demonstrated how to categorize different materials, plants, or techniques, the languages of those societies would reflect this guidance. Over generations, the categories would persist even as the practices surrounding them changed. The languages would carry the memory long after the origin faded from view. Legends present another form of enduring clue. Many cultures preserved stories of early teachers, long-lived strangers, or wise visitors who transformed communities. These legends behave differently from typical myth. They contain practical details about agriculture, law, architecture, and astronomy. They describe teaching rather than spectacle. They portray the beings not as supernatural forces, but as individuals with advanced understanding. The legends often frame these interactions in narrative form because storytelling was the most reliable method of preserving information across generations. As societies changed, the stories adapted, but the core structure remained stable. Some legends describe specific instructions given by the beings. These instructions survive in symbolic form but retain their underlying logic. For example, stories about measuring land using ropes, observing the sky at particular times of year, or organising communities around central spaces reflect practical lessons. The stories preserve the teaching even after the cultural context shifts. If the beings shared knowledge in these areas, the stories would be a natural way for early societies to preserve it. The narrative form allows the teaching to survive changes in language, leadership, and tradition. In many regions, legends about the origins of law present the beings as the sources of early codes. These accounts do not describe divine commandments in the later religious sense. They describe practical frameworks for resolving disputes, distributing resources, and maintaining social stability. The laws attributed to these beings often reflect advanced understanding of human behaviour. They are structured, balanced, and focused on preventing conflict. Their appearance in early history suggests instruction rather than improvisation. If the beings remained on Earth, their guidance in developing these laws would leave a lasting imprint. Over time, the origin would be forgotten, but the principles would endure. Some legal traditions contain concepts too refined for early societies to have developed independently. For instance, proportional compensation for damages, inheritance rules designed to maintain stability, and standardized weights and measures all appear early in the historical record. These systems require abstract thinking and long-term planning. They also require familiarity with social structures. If the beings taught early societies how to design fair and consistent laws, these elements would appear as stable features in multiple regions. The persistence of similar legal principles across distant cultures supports the possibility of shared instruction. Another category of linguistic and legal clues involves specialized vocabulary related to governance. Early words for council, assembly, decree, and census appear fully formed in societies that had only recently become urban. The complexity of these terms suggests that early humans received instruction on how to manage growing populations. The beings may have shared frameworks for organizing communities, ensuring fairness, and maintaining order. These frameworks would be preserved in the terminology. Even as societies changed, the language would carry the memory of the original instruction. Some traditions also contain references to laws restricting interaction with certain groups or locations. These laws are often framed as protecting sacred spaces or preserving ritual purity. But the earliest versions sometimes describe the restrictions in practical terms, limiting access to areas inhabited by older beings or preserving boundaries agreed upon long ago. Over time, the reasons for the restrictions faded. The laws themselves remained. They became part of the cultural structure long after the beings withdrew. Such laws behave like artifacts of earlier agreements, preserved through tradition even when their purpose is no longer understood. Legends also preserve descriptions of objects or tools associated with the beings. These descriptions are often vague in later retellings, but specific in the earliest versions. They refer to devices used for measuring, recording, or constructing. The stories describe these tools as ordinary, not symbolic. Early storytellers clearly regarded them as real objects, even if they did not fully understand their function. As time passed, the objects became metaphorical in the stories, but the legends retained the descriptions. These lingering details serve as linguistic memories of technologies the beings may have introduced. Some languages contain words for tools or techniques that appear long before the societies using them develop the skills associated with those terms. These words function as placeholders, preserving concepts that would only later become relevant. Linguists often identify them as relic terms. They suggest that early humans learned certain ideas before they were fully equipped to apply them. If the beings shared knowledge gradually, these relic terms would be the linguistic residue of early lessons intended to prepare societies for future development. Myths about origins often preserve structural clues. Many ancient cultures describe being taught by figures who arrived during early settlement periods. These figures are portrayed consistently as knowledgeable and calm rather than supernatural. Their teachings often focus on practical subjects. Over time, the stories expanded, adding symbolic layers, but the earliest versions remain grounded. They behave like memories passed down through narrative. The consistency of these structures across continents suggests a shared pattern of influence. If the beings interacted with different societies at different times, the legends would preserve these interactions in recognizable forms, even after centuries of reinterpretation. Some linguistic roots appear across unrelated languages, hinting at a shared ancient source. These roots often relate to measurement, astronomy, or governance. Their presence in distant regions suggests diffusion not through trade or conquest, but through parallel instruction. If the beings traveled between regions or interacted with different groups independently, their terminology would appear in multiple cultural lineages. As languages evolved, the roots would persist, embedded within vocabulary that no longer reveals its origin. Another category of clues appears in ritual language. Many rituals preserve phrases that are linguistically older than the surrounding text. These phrases often relate to cycles of time, celestial observation, or agricultural practices. Their archaic nature suggests that they were inherited from an earlier source and maintained without full understanding. Rituals tend to preserve language because they are repeated with care. If the beings taught early societies specific phrases for alignment, observation, or timing, the rituals would preserve those phrases long after their origin faded. In legal codes across the ancient world, Certain principles appear repeatedly: fairness, proportional judgment, responsibility, and community stability. These principles require a level of abstraction and foresight often attributed to much later societies. Yet they appear in some of the earliest codes. They behave like frameworks introduced from outside rather than developed gradually. If the beings sought to stabilize early human societies before withdrawing, they would have introduced legal structures capable of enduring change. The survival of these principles across regions suggests that the beings taught similar concepts to multiple groups. Some legends also preserve details about agreements between humans and the beings. These agreements are often described as covenants, pacts, or instructions for maintaining order. The stories present them in practical terms, outlining boundaries, responsibilities, and expectations. These agreements resemble early diplomatic efforts rather than divine commandments. Over time, the symbolic meaning overshadow the practical origin, but the legends still carry traces of negotiation and mutual understanding. If the beings remained on Earth but limited open involvement, these agreements would reflect the framework under which interactions continued. Languages also contain unusual stability in certain areas of vocabulary. While most words evolve quickly, some remain unchanged for thousands of years. These words often relate to foundational concepts such as measurement, direction, or timekeeping. Their stability suggests that early societies saw these terms as fixed, perhaps because they were introduced by a source perceived as authoritative. If the beings taught early humans how to measure time or navigate by the stars, the words describing these activities would remain stable across generations. Legends further preserve the idea that certain laws were introduced by wise strangers. These strangers are described as knowledgeable but unassuming. They did not demand authority. They offered guidance, then left decisions to the community. Their laws often focused on balance and reciprocity, concepts requiring long-term perspective. Over time, the strangers became mythologized, but the structure of the laws remained. The stories behave like memories of early instruction. Some languages contain honorifics used only in narrow contexts, referring to individuals with authority derived from knowledge rather than birth. These honorifics often appear in early records describing interactions with wise visitors. Over time, the honorifics shifted in meaning, but their original use reveals a category of individuals distinct from rulers or priests. These individuals may have been the beings who chose to blend in. The language preserves their social role long after their identities faded. Another category of clues appears in the metaphors embedded within languages. Many metaphors relating to knowledge, structure, or guidance reflect concepts that seem unusually advanced for early societies. They use imagery tied to measurement, alignment, or long-term planning. These metaphors behave like linguistic fossils from an earlier era of instruction. If the beings taught early humans using practical demonstrations, these metaphors would preserve the instructional framework. As languages evolve, they often simplify or complicate structures depending on cultural needs. But some linguistic features remain unreasonably stable. Certain verb forms, prefixes, or grammatical patterns persist with little change. These features often relate to commands, instructions, or descriptions of processes. Their stability suggests that they were introduced early and preserved through ritual or formal use. If the beings taught early humans using structured language, the grammatical patterns would reflect the clarity of their instruction. Legends also carry clues in the form of recurring story patterns. Across continents, stories describe early teachers who departed gradually, leaving behind knowledge intended to help society develop independently. These teachers are portrayed consistently across cultures: calm, practical, and withdrawn. Their presence is not described as miraculous. It is presented as natural, even ordinary. The consistency of this story structure suggests a shared origin. If the beings remained on Earth and gradually reduced their involvement, these legends would preserve the memory of that transition. Legal traditions preserve another category of clues. Many early societies maintained separate legal categories for individuals who were not fully part of the community but held respected roles. These categories often included healers, sages, or advisors. Their legal status reflects the presence of individuals who existed at the edge of society, contributing knowledge without integrating completely. If the beings blended in selectively, the legal systems would reflect their presence. Taken together, the clues preserved in languages, legends, and laws form a quiet record of early interaction. They behave like memories stored in the structure of human culture. They preserve frameworks older than the societies that inherited them. They reflect the influence of beings who may have remained present long after stepping away from public view. As the narrative continues, the next part turns toward the scholars and skeptics who study these clues today. Their attempts to interpret the patterns reveal how modern understanding intersects with ancient memory, providing a steady path forward in the exploration of this idea. Across the modern world, scholars and skeptics often find themselves circling the same quiet questions that earlier civilizations seemed to take for granted. The stories of early teachers, the sudden appearance of advanced knowledge, the persistence of strange linguistic roots, and the architectural puzzles that lie scattered across continents all create patterns that do not fit neatly into the linear model of human development. Some researchers specialize in early writing systems, others focus on astronomy, archaeology, or comparative mythology. They come from different disciplines and different countries, yet many of them encounter the same difficulties when trying to explain how certain ideas, techniques, or structures emerged with such completeness in eras that should have lacked the foundations needed to produce them. Their attempts to solve these puzzles reveal a consistent struggle. The evidence resists simple interpretation, yet it refuses to disappear. It continues to present itself quietly, waiting for someone to notice the subtle links binding it together. In academic environments, the earliest developments of civilization are often described as the result of gradual innovation. This explanation works well for many aspects of human history, but there are moments when the expected pattern of slow refinement does not appear. Scholars examining the origins of writing in Mesopotamia, for instance, acknowledge that the first tablets emerge with surprising sophistication. The system of signs is already organized. The symbols are standardized. The administrative structure behind the writing is already functioning. There is no long chain of experimental marks leading toward the system. It arrives in a complete form. Researchers debate how this happened. Some attribute it to a burst of creativity. Others propose lost earlier records. But none of these explanations fully resolves the question of how a complex system could appear so suddenly. The puzzle remains, quietly challenging assumptions about the nature of invention. Archaeologists confront similar puzzles when studying early cities. The first phases of urban development in regions such as Sumer, the Indus Valley, and ancient Egypt exhibit planning that exceeds what is expected of societies transitioning from small settlements to large communities. Streets are aligned, districts are organized, and resource management systems appear in place. These features imply a level of foresight characteristic of societies that have already experienced urban life, yet the archaeological layers beneath reveal no gradual evolution. Scholars attempt to explain these jumps by proposing cultural diffusion, environmental pressure, or early experimentation. But these explanations often lack the supporting evidence needed to make them convincing. The problem is that the cities behave as if someone already understood how a city should function, and guided the process quietly in the background. Architectural anomalies present another area where scholars and skeptics encounter persistent difficulties. Certain ancient structures exhibit techniques far ahead of their time, stone blocks cut with precision unmatched by later builders. Foundations aligned with astronomical cycles requiring advanced observation. Towers and platforms constructed with stability that reflects knowledge of engineering not yet documented in early societies. Critics often caution against reading too much into these features. suggesting that human ingenuity can produce remarkable results even without advanced tools. Yet, when examining multiple regions in which similar feats appear suddenly and without earlier prototypes, the pattern becomes harder to dismiss. Scholars find themselves returning to the same questions, wondering how widespread communities with limited resources manage to achieve such uniform clarity of design. Astronomers studying early observations of the sky confront challenges of their own. Some ancient records contain calculations or predictions that align closely with celestial events, requiring a level of mathematical proficiency not expected of the societies recording them. Researchers attempt to reconstruct how these calculations might have been made, proposing observational methods or trial and error processes. Yet, the accuracy in some cases suggests a pre-existing framework introduced long before these societies developed the tools needed to generate such results independently. The puzzle intensifies when similar patterns appear across separate regions with no known communication. Scholars recognize the difficulty but often tread carefully, preferring to attribute the similarities to coincidence or parallel development rather than entertain the possibility of a shared external influence. Skeptics play an important role in this landscape. They caution against assuming connections where none exist. They argue for simpler explanations whenever possible. They remind researchers that human creativity and adaptation can produce surprising outcomes. But even skeptics encounter puzzles that resist traditional interpretation. They often acknowledge that certain linguistic roots have no clear origin, that some legal concepts appear too refined for the cultures that adopted them, and that certain myths carry structural similarities too consistent to be ignored. Their caution does not erase the puzzles. It simply keeps the discussion grounded. Yet, in grounding the conversation, skeptics also highlight the areas where evidence remains stubbornly out of place. Comparative mythologists encounter one of the most persistent puzzles. When examining stories from ancient civilizations, they find patterns that reappear across time and geography. Figures described as long-lived, wise, and calm appear in myths from Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Andes, East Asia, and the Pacific. These figures teach agriculture, astronomy, governance, or medicine. Their stories are practical, not mystical. They fade from visibility gradually rather than disappearing dramatically. The structural consistency of these myths suggests an underlying pattern. Scholars debate the source of this pattern. Some argue that common human experiences produce similar stories. Others propose migration or cultural exchange. But the scope and stability of the parallels challenge these explanations. The myths behave as if they preserve memories of interactions with individuals who played similar roles in different regions. Linguists face another challenge. Some words within ancient languages remain isolated, with no clear linguistic ancestors or evolutionary paths. These words often relate to measurement, architecture, or astronomical observation. Linguists classify them as relic terms, acknowledging their presence without being able to explain their origin. The persistence of these terms across languages that otherwise evolve separately raises questions about their introduction. Scholars propose borrowing from earlier cultures, but the timing and distribution of the terms do not always align with known patterns of cultural contact. The anomalies create tension between the models used to explain linguistic development and the evidence preserved in the languages themselves. Legal historians encounter puzzles in early law codes. Some of the earliest written laws exhibit refined principles that would normally develop after centuries of societal experience. Concepts such as proportional justice, standardized compensation, and structured inheritance appear in the earliest records. These principles require a deep understanding of social dynamics. Their early appearance suggests that the societies adopting them received guidance from individuals familiar with long-term governance. Critics propose that these societies may have possessed more administrative experience than their archaeological record suggests. Yet, the absence of earlier materials leaves the origin of these principles unexplained. Anthropologists studying early cultural practices also find difficulties. Some rituals preserve language or motions that appear older than the surrounding culture. These preserved elements behave like fragments from an earlier era of instruction. Anthropologists often describe them as remnants of forgotten customs. Yet the consistency of these fragments across different regions suggests a more widespread pattern. The rituals may represent the oldest layer of cultural memory, preserved through repetition long after the original meaning faded. Scholars who examine technological history face puzzles surrounding the sudden appearance of advanced techniques. Metalworking, masonry, navigation, and large-scale irrigation emerge in some societies with a level of refinement that surpasses the expected developmental stage. Critics suggest that these techniques may have been discovered independently in each region, but the similarities between techniques used by cultures separated by vast distances suggest diffusion or instruction rather than independent invention. The problem becomes more pronounced when these techniques appear fully formed without transitional stages. Scholars attempt to fill the gaps with hypotheses about lost records or destroyed settlements, but these explanations remain speculative. Even skeptics who firmly reject external influence acknowledge that certain archaeological layers present unsolved mysteries. They recognize that the earliest examples of some crafts are often the most advanced. They note that society sometimes appears to lose knowledge rather than gain it over time. These patterns challenge the standard model of gradual improvement. Skeptics argue that environmental disasters, population shifts, or cultural changes may explain the losses. Yet, the lack of clear causal evidence leaves room for uncertainty. Modern researchers studying genetic history encounter their own puzzles. Genetic markers appear in human populations that suggest ancient migrations or interactions not fully understood. Some patterns imply the presence of small, distinct groups that moved through early human societies without integrating fully. These groups left traces in the genetic record, but not enough to identify who they were, where they lived, or what roles they played. Scholars debate whether these patterns indicate isolated human communities or something more unusual. The puzzles remain open, awaiting further evidence. Some researchers working in interdisciplinary fields, combining archaeology, genetics, linguistics, and mythological studies, propose that early societies received guidance from a small group of individuals with advanced knowledge. They present models suggesting that these individuals acted as catalysts during key moments of development. Their hypothesis does not claim supernatural intervention. It suggests a small group of unusually long-lived, knowledgeable individuals moving quietly across regions. Critics challenge this idea, arguing that it lacks concrete evidence. Supporters of the model counter that many ancient puzzles remain unresolved without considering such possibilities. The debate continues without reaching final consensus. In academic circles, discussions about the origins of civilization often revolve around what is known rather than what is possible. Scholars prefer caution, grounding interpretations in evidence. They emphasize the importance of avoiding speculation. Yet, within their cautious analyses, the strange consistency of certain patterns remains. They acknowledge the puzzles even when no satisfactory explanation exists. They note that some aspects of early civilization appear too refined for their time. They accept that some myths behave like memories rather than imagination. They recognize that certain linguistic features trace back to unknown sources. These acknowledgements remain quiet, often appearing in footnotes, side remarks, or tentative sections of research papers. Outside academic settings, independent researchers pursue these puzzles with greater freedom. They notice patterns that scholars, constrained by academic rigor, hesitate to pursue fully. These researchers collect data from mythology, geology, astronomy, and archaeology, looking for correlations. Some propose elaborate theories, while others focus on practical interpretations. Although their conclusions vary widely, they often identify the same anomalies. They ask why certain knowledge appears suddenly. They question why similar myths arise across continents. They examine stone structures and measurement systems that seem more advanced than the societies producing them. Their work is sometimes criticised for lack of restraint, yet their observations often highlight real puzzles that remain unresolved. Within this landscape of inquiry, skeptics continue to emphasise the need for evidence. They challenge assumptions and test claims within a rigorous framework. Their skepticism provides balance, preventing interpretations from drifting too far into speculation. Yet, even skeptics cannot fully ignore the recurring patterns. They acknowledge that ancient development contains moments of unusual acceleration. They recognise that some physical structures defy easy explanation. They admit that certain artefacts were created with methods still not fully understood. Their skepticism sharpens the discussion, clarifying which puzzles are genuine and which are the result of misinterpretation. The interplay between scholars and skeptics creates a field of tension, one that preserves the integrity of inquiry, while leaving space for unanswered questions. This tension is not adversarial. It reflects a collective recognition that early human history contains layers that are difficult to decipher. Some researchers lean toward conventional explanations. Others propose alternative perspectives, but all must contend with the evidence that remains. The puzzles persist through every attempt to explain them. They behave like echoes of interactions that once shaped the world, leaving behind clues scattered through stone, language, story, and lore. In the quiet moments of study, researchers sometimes acknowledge the possibility that their models may be incomplete. They recognise that history is often shaped by events not easily recorded, by individuals who do not fit within traditional frameworks, by influences that leave subtle traces rather than overt declarations. The early myths, the linguistic anomalies, the architectural puzzles, and the legal structures may all reflect the work of individuals who stepped into human history with knowledge shaped by long experience. Whether these individuals were human or something else remains an open question for many scholars. The evidence is neither definitive nor dismissible. It exists in a liminal space, waiting for interpretation. As technology improves and new data emerges, scholars revisit the puzzles with fresh eyes. Satellite imagery reveals ancient structures hidden beneath soil and vegetation. Genetic studies uncover migration patterns previously unknown. Linguistic analysis identifies root terms older than expected. Archaeological surveys uncover new anomalies. Each discovery adds to the tapestry of evidence, deepening the mystery rather than resolving it. The puzzles become clearer, not simpler. They invite continued exploration without offering easy conclusions. Some researchers suggest that early humans may have encountered a group with advanced understanding, whose influence shaped the earlier stages of civilization. They propose that these individuals lived quietly, integrating into communities, teaching selectively, and withdrawing gradually. Critics counter that such ideas remain speculative. Yet the models that rely solely on human innovation sometimes struggle to explain the sudden appearance of certain knowledge. The debate reflects the broader tension between evidence and interpretation. Scholars recognise the gaps but differ in how they choose to fill them. Skeptics often argue that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. They point out that ancient history contains many mysteries, but not all require unusual explanations. They encourage patience, suggesting that future discoveries may resolve the puzzles within natural frameworks. Their caution keeps the discussion grounded, but the puzzles continue to accumulate. They form a landscape of unanswered questions that neither scholars nor skeptics can easily ignore. The puzzles themselves behave like quiet reminders of a possibility that ancient people took for granted, that their earliest teachers were not entirely human, or at least not entirely ordinary. The myths, languages, and structures seem to retain the imprint of beings who shaped early civilization. Whether these beings were divine, human, or something in between remains a matter of interpretation. Scholars analyze the evidence carefully. Skeptics test the claims rigorously. Yet both groups encounter the same anomalies. The patterns remain steady, standing quietly behind the boundaries of accepted knowledge. As this narrative continues, the next part follows the line between scientific inquiry and cultural memory. It explores the space between evidence and belief, examining how ancient stories and modern perspectives converge on the idea that early civilization may have been shaped by a presence that never truly vanished. Throughout history, civilizations rise and fall in visible patterns. They build monuments, develop languages, expand through trade, and leave behind artifacts that help later societies understand their world. Even when a culture fades, the traces of its existence usually remain in layers of soil, in ruined foundations, or in the fragments of pottery scattered across ancient ground. But there are other kinds of civilizations, the ones that move quietly at the edges of recorded history, influencing without claiming territory, teaching without declaring authority, and withdrawing without leaving ruins behind. These civilizations do not disappear abruptly. They shift slowly into the background of human development. When examining the deep past with this idea in mind, a different pattern emerges, one in which a civilization could step away from public view while continuing to exist, its members choosing subtlety over visibility, guidance over dominance, and endurance over recognition. The earlier stories preserved in human cultures describe visitors who behaved more like mentors than rulers. They shared knowledge, encouraged organization, and guided the first cities into existence. These figures rarely demanded tribute or obedience. They often avoided public display. Their presence, as described in early myths, aligns more closely with individuals who prefer collaboration to control. When a civilization behaves this way, it becomes easy for it to shift into a quieter mode of existence without vanishing entirely. Its influence diminishes gradually, replaced by human adaptation and innovation. Yet its knowledge remains embedded within the structures it helped establish. This slow transition allows the civilization to step back without leaving a clear moment of departure. Archaeology offers examples of this pattern in societies that appear suddenly with advanced skills and then disperse without collapse. Their techniques become absorbed by neighbouring groups. Their architectural styles influence other regions. Their knowledge continues through cultural diffusion. When viewed through that lens, it becomes less difficult to imagine a civilization choosing to retreat deliberately. If the beings remembered in early myths valued privacy or stability, they may have recognized that remaining openly among growing human populations would eventually create tension. Their decision to reduce visibility would be a practical choice, allowing humans to grow independently while preserving the being's way of life. A civilization does not need to vanish physically to disappear from history. It needs only to stop participating openly in cultural exchange. Without artifacts, texts, or monuments bearing its imprint, later generations would not be able to identify its presence. If the beings lived in remote areas, avoided constructing permanent cities, and interacted only with select individuals, their disappearance would resemble a quiet retreat rather than a collapse. Over time, human societies would forget the details of their involvement. Only fragments of memory would remain, stories, metaphors, unexplained skills. These fragments would persist in myths and rituals, but the civilization behind them would remain hidden. Some modern researchers studying isolated human communities encounter hints of older traditions that do not belong to the cultural context. These traditions describe knowledge of the sky, the land, or the body that seems inconsistent with the technological level of the community. Anthropologists often attribute this to ancient cultural exchange or forgotten migration patterns. Yet, the consistency of these anomalies across regions suggests another possibility. They may represent the remnants of interactions with a civilization that gradually withdrew. The communities preserved the teachings while the teachers faded into obscurity. In regions where early cities once thrived, there are stories of strangers who visited during times of crisis. These strangers provided guidance on irrigation, harvest, or governance, and then left as quietly as they arrived. The stories present them as calm and knowledgeable, not supernatural or mysterious. If they were members of a civilization seeking to remain unnoticed, these brief appearances would serve as subtle intervention without revealing the full extent of their presence. Over generations, the strangers became figures of legend. The civilization behind them remained unnamed. The stories behave like memories of a group that chose to reduce contact slowly, allowing humans to take on responsibilities once shared with these early teachers. In some areas, myths describe the departure of wise beings as a gradual process rather than a single event. They do not vanish into the sky or sink beneath the earth. They retreat into distant mountains, deep forests, or remote islands. These locations align with real places where isolated communities could survive without detection. The myths treat the withdrawal not as abandonment but as a necessary transition. The beings step away because humans have grown capable of guiding their own development. The myths preserve the idea that the beings still exist somewhere, living quietly in places where they cannot be reached easily. If their civilization chose this path, it would explain why no collapse appears in the archaeological record. The civilization simply reduced its footprint, allowing human culture to dominate the visible landscape. Historians examining the development of complex social structures often note that certain principles appear too early and too uniformly to result from local experimentation alone. Systems of measurement, organization of labor, and early forms of law display refinement that suggests collaborative planning. If these systems originated from a civilization with deep experience, their introduction could have occurred gradually, through interactions with select individuals or groups. Once transmitted, the civilization could step back, allowing humans to adapt the frameworks independently. Over time, the original source would become obscured. Only the systems themselves would remain, interpreted as the product of early human ingenuity. Another consideration lies in the nature of knowledge itself. Some technologies introduced in early periods appear inconsistent with the available resources and skills, yet their presence cannot be dismissed. They are real, well documented, and carefully studied. They represent moments where human societies suddenly gained capabilities far beyond their previous experience. Scholars often struggle to explain these leaps. They propose lost periods of experimentation or undocumented cultural exchange. But the simplest explanation may be that a civilization with advanced understanding introduced these ideas in controlled ways. By limiting their involvement and teaching only what was necessary, they ensured that human development proceeded without dependency. The civilization could then reduce visibility without disrupting progress. Civilizations capable of such restraint demonstrate a different approach to cultural interaction. Rather than imposing their identity or expanding their influence, they act as stewards or tutors. Their goal is not domination but stability. If they recognize that direct involvement would eventually complicate human development, they may have chosen to adopt a quieter role early on. Their withdrawal would not be driven by decline but by practical foresight. By reducing their presence, they allow human societies to develop independently while continuing to exist in parallel. Some traditions describe hidden communities of long-lived individuals said to preserve knowledge older than the surrounding culture. These communities appear in myths across multiple continents. They are portrayed not as magical realms but as quiet societies living apart from humans. They maintain privacy, avoid conflict, and intervene only when necessary. The consistency of these depictions suggests that they may preserve memories of a civilization that chose withdrawal rather than disappearance. Their presence would be difficult to detect archaeologically if they avoided constructing large settlements or using materials that survive long-term. Their traces would be linguistic, cultural, or behavioral rather than material. Over millennia, these clues would become interwoven with human tradition. A civilization capable of blending in, guiding quietly, and eventually stepping back would require stability, long-term planning, and deep understanding of human behavior. If the beings remembered in early myths possessed long lifespans or advanced knowledge, they would have the perspective necessary to implement such a plan. They would not need monuments or empires to sustain their identity. They could preserve their civilization through continuity of lineage, tradition, and knowledge. Their existence would not depend on visibility. It would depend on preservation of purpose. Some modern researchers studying isolated populations note that certain genetic markers appear unexpectedly, representing small groups that interacted with humans in ancient times. These markers do not align with known migration patterns. They appear briefly and then disappear from the genetic landscape. Scholars debate whether these markers represent lost human groups or something else. If a civilization with advanced knowledge existed alongside early humans but maintained limited contact, such genetic traces could reflect rare interactions. Over time, these markers would diminish as the civilization withdrew further. The traces would remain subtle, present only in small fragments rather than widespread signatures. Historical records also show periods where knowledge declines unexpectedly. Techniques known to early societies become lost generations later. Architectural skills degrade. Astronomical records become less precise. Metallurgical processes simplify. These declines are often attributed to war, famine, or social upheaval, but they could also reflect the withdrawal of a guiding civilization. If the beings gradually reduced contact, the knowledge they introduced would fade without sustained instruction. Human societies would retain fragments, but lose the most complex elements. This pattern appears across continents, suggesting that certain kinds of knowledge were not generated locally, but preserved through external support. When that support disappeared, the knowledge declined naturally. A civilization choosing quiet withdrawal would not seek recognition in human records. It would not leave declarations of its existence. It would not require monuments. Its members would not present themselves as rulers or gods. They would live in places difficult to access, move carefully across regions, and interact selectively. Their traces would appear only where necessary, in myths of wise strangers, in refined legal principles, in early scientific concepts, in architectural anomalies, and in unexplained linguistic roots. These clues would behave like faint echoes rather than declarations. The idea of a civilization going quiet without disappearing also aligns with the persistence of legends describing beings who still exist somewhere, watching or waiting. These legends are widespread but understated. They do not depict dramatic returns or future interventions. They portray the beings as continuing their lives beyond the reach of human society. Their continued existence is portrayed not as divine but as practical. They live elsewhere, maintaining their way of life. The legends frame this withdrawal as intentional rather than forced. They emphasize continuity rather than ending. Some modern scholars exploring the origins of civilization acknowledge that early development appears more uniform than expected. Techniques, symbols, and social structures appear simultaneously in distant regions. These similarities could result from common environmental pressures, but they could also reflect influence from a civilization that moved across regions quietly, sharing knowledge selectively. The beings would not need to reveal their identity or impose their culture. They could support development without leaving visible institutions. Their presence would remain unnoticed by future archaeologists, yet their influence would guide early human advancement. A civilization capable of blending into human society would require patience and restraint. It would avoid unnecessary exposure, intervene only when needed, and value long-term stability over short-term impact. If its members possess long lifespans or advanced understanding, they could maintain this approach for generations. They would have no reason to pursue dominance or recognition. Their goal would be preservation of their own culture, along with support for emerging human societies. This approach would create a world where two civilizations coexist, one visible and expanding, the other quiet and enduring. As human populations grew larger and more complex, maintaining anonymity would require shifting strategies. Early societies were small enough that a long-lived being could gradually retreat into the background. But as urban centres expanded and social structures became more intricate, remaining hidden required greater care. The beings may have recognised this shift and adapted accordingly. They may have chosen to withdraw into increasingly remote areas, interacting only with individuals capable of understanding their perspective. The civilizations known to history would develop without direct interference. The quiet civilization would continue its existence parallel to human progress. In modern times, scholars occasionally encounter myths or reports describing isolated groups living in remote regions. These stories often involve individuals who appear unusually healthy, knowledgeable, or long-lived. While many of these accounts are exaggerated or symbolic, the consistency across different cultures suggests that they may originate from real encounters. The groups described do not seek contact or influence. They live quietly, regulating their interaction with the outside world. If a civilization withdrew intentionally, these remaining groups could represent the last visible traces of its presence. Over time, their secrecy would become stronger, their locations more remote, and their interactions rarer. The civilization would not disappear. It would shift almost entirely out of view. From the perspective of scientific inquiry, the idea that a civilization could step away without leaving obvious evidence requires reconsidering assumptions about how civilizations behave. Most known cultures leave behind ruins because they build extensively, expand widely, and use materials that endure. A civilization choosing not to do so would leave minimal physical trace. Its disappearance from history would be interpreted as non-existence, yet its influence could remain in intangible forms, in knowledge, memory, and tradition. When viewed through this lens, the puzzles of early human development take on a different shape. They become clues to a quieter presence, one that interacted carefully and then retreated. As this narrative prepares to continue, the next part moves toward the possibility that if such a civilization existed quietly alongside humans, its presence would shape not only early development, but also modern understanding. The next section begins to explore what it means for humanity if the beings never left at all, continuing their existence in ways that remain intertwined with our world even now. If the beings remembered in the oldest stories never fully left this world, then their presence would not be something loud, dramatic, or disruptive. It would exist in the background of human life, steady and almost invisible, woven into the quiet spaces that most people rarely think about. Their existence would shape human history not through dominance or display, but through an enduring influence that blends into the ordinary flow of development. To understand what that means for us now, it helps to consider how their presence would interact with the world we have built, how it might appear in subtle ways rather than grand gestures, and how its quiet continuity would affect our perception of progress, knowledge, and identity. If they are still here, living as they once did, close enough to observe but distant enough to remain unseen, their relationship with humanity would be different from what it was thousands of years ago. Early humans relied on guidance to establish cities, measure seasons, and organize societies. Modern humans live in a world shaped by technology, global communication, and complex institutions. A civilization that chose subtlety over recognition would understand that direct involvement now could create confusion, dependency, or cultural upheaval. Their presence would therefore be oriented towards silence rather than interaction. They would watch without interfering unnecessarily, stepping in only at moments where balance requires a small adjustment or where knowledge must be preserved from disappearing entirely. Their continued existence would also mean that the story of human development is incomplete. Many assume that humanity advanced through a combination of creativity, necessity, and incremental discovery, and in many ways that is true. But if another civilization remained beside us, shaping just enough of the early foundation to guide the path forward, then a portion of what we call human ingenuity might come from lessons that were introduced gently, long before written history began. This does not diminish human achievement. It means that real progress is often collaborative, shaped not only by people but by individuals who understood how to create stable societies without demanding recognition. If they remain here, then the advances that followed those early lessons reflect a partnership rather than isolation. In such a scenario, their civilization would likely function according to principles unfamiliar to modern society. They would not organize themselves through nation-states or economic systems. Their community would be built around continuity and preservation rather than expansion. They would not seek influence in the visible world. They would not compete for resources. Their culture would value stability, long-term thinking, and careful adaptation. The natural world would provide the boundaries they need for privacy. Remote mountains, deep forests, hidden valleys, and other isolated regions could allow them to exist without attracting notice. Even in the modern era, large portions of the world remain uninhabited or sparsely explored. A civilization skilled at avoiding attention could easily remain within these areas without revealing itself. If they are still here, their interaction with humans today would not resemble the stories of ancient myths. They would understand that human societies have changed. People rely on scientific evidence, institutional authority, and shared communication networks to shape their understanding of the world. A visible presence from a long-lived or advanced civilization would disrupt expectations and challenge the foundations of science, religion, and culture. To preserve stability, they would avoid direct contact. Their involvement, if necessary, would focus on subtle forms, nudging a discovery into the right hands, guiding a breakthrough towards someone capable of using it responsibly, or preserving knowledge that might otherwise be lost. These efforts would appear to humans as coincidences, moments of insight or unexpected clarity. Some people speculate that if they remained, they might have influenced certain advancements in human history. The emergence of mathematics, early astronomy, or advanced architecture could reflect early lessons they introduced. But in the modern world, knowledge expands rapidly. Humans no longer need external instruction to understand the cosmos or the laws of nature. Instead, the beings would likely shift their role from teacher to observer. Their presence would serve as a safeguard rather than a guide. They would avoid intervening unless human development risked destabilizing the world in a way that would endanger both civilizations. Even then, intervention would remain subtle, maintaining the delicate balance between help and independence. If they continue to exist alongside us, it raises the question of how they maintain their privacy in a world filled with satellites, drones, maps, and sensors. One explanation is that their understanding of concealment surpasses our detection methods. They may know how to read environmental patterns, how to predict exploration routes, and how to avoid areas likely to attract attention. They may occupy locations where human presence remains minimal due to inaccessibility or lack of interest. Some remote regions around the world still contain vast expanses where few people travel. A civilization that values privacy and endurance would choose such areas deliberately. Another possibility is that they maintain a mode of existence that minimizes environmental impact. Human societies leave behind debris, noise, construction, and infrastructure. A civilization with different values might live in harmony with the landscape, leaving no trace detectable by modern equipment. They would avoid altering the land in ways that create visible signatures. They would move lightly, leaving behind nothing that resembles familiar structures. This approach would allow them to coexist without revealing themselves, even in an age of global observation. If they are still here, it also affects how we interpret the unexplained stories that occasionally surface in the modern world. Reports of encounters with strangers who seem unusually calm, articulate, or knowledgeable might reflect brief moments of contact. These individuals sometimes appear in remote areas, offering guidance or assistance before vanishing. While many such stories become embellished or misinterpreted, The consistency across different accounts and cultures suggests that there may be a pattern underlying them. The beings would not present themselves openly. They would appear only when circumstances require, and they would ensure that their presence remains ambiguous enough not to disrupt human understanding of the world. Their continued existence would also mean that humanity has never been fully alone in shaping its history. This perspective can alter the way people interpret their role in the world. Instead of viewing development as an isolated human achievement, it becomes part of a much larger narrative involving cooperation, influence, and shared evolution. The being's withdrawal from public life reflects trust in humanity's ability to grow independently. It suggests a long-term relationship defined not by control, but by mutual respect. Their civilization would maintain its identity without imposing it on humanity. Our civilization would build upon the lessons introduced long ago, expanding in ways the beings may have anticipated. From a scientific perspective, the idea that they are still here challenges assumptions about how civilizations behave over long periods. Most models of cultural evolution predict either expansion or collapse, but a third possibility exists: withdrawal. A civilization that prioritizes privacy, stability, and self-sufficiency could choose not to expand. It could maintain a steady population, avoid conflict, and sustain itself through knowledge and tradition rather than territory. Such a civilization would not leave behind abandoned cities or artifacts. Its existence would appear invisible to future researchers, yet its influence could persist in subtle ways. If they remain, their perspective on human society would likely be shaped by long-term observation. They would have witnessed the rise of kingdoms, the fall of empires, the development of technology, and the increasing complexity of global systems. Their understanding of humanity would be deep and nuanced. They would recognize patterns that humans notice only in hindsight. They would know when intervention might cause more harm than good. Their silence would not reflect indifference. It would reflect maturity and restraint. A civilization with centuries of stability would understand the value of allowing younger societies to learn through experience. The presence of such a civilization would also influence how we understand the future. If they are still here, then human progress exists within a broader context than most people realize. Our technological advancements, cultural transformations, and global challenges would be observed by beings with a different perspective. They would understand the consequences of rapid change and the importance of balance. Their presence might help maintain stability in subtle ways, ensuring that humanity does not move toward outcomes that threaten long-term survival. This influence would be gentle, appearing through opportunities, coincidences, or moments of clarity rather than visible intervention. If they continue to exist beside us, then the concept of ancient memory takes on a different meaning. Myths describing wise strangers, long-lived teachers, or hidden communities may contain more truth than symbolism. Languages may preserve fragments of their influence. Laws may reflect their early guidance. Scientific principles introduced in ancient times may represent the foundational knowledge they once shared. Understanding this does not require belief in supernatural beings. It requires recognizing that civilizations can interact in ways that leave subtle, yet enduring marks on the world. For humanity, their continued presence would mean that we are not the first to understand the importance of stability, knowledge, and restraint. It would mean that someone else has navigated the challenges of survival, adaptation, and coexistence long before our societies emerged. Their experience would give them insight into the patterns of development and decline that humans encounter. Their approach would reflect a deep understanding of how to maintain continuity over vast stretches of time. Modern society rarely considers the possibility of a quiet civilization existing alongside the visible world. Yet, when examining the puzzles of early history and the patterns that persist across cultures, the idea becomes less speculative. It becomes a framework for understanding how knowledge travels across centuries, how memory persists through stories, and how influence can shape development without leaving obvious traces. If they are still here, then their presence becomes part of the background of human existence. It shapes the world subtly, appearing in the continuity of certain traditions, in the quiet evolution of ideas, and in the recurring patterns that defy easy explanation. Their silence does not indicate absence. It reflects a choice, a deliberate shift from teacher to observer, from guide to guardian, from visible influence to hidden continuity. As the narrative moves toward its closing section, the next part explores the deeper implications of this possibility. It examines why the idea of their continued presence still resonates across cultures, and why the world, despite all its changes, continues to echo the memory of a civilization that stepped into the background without ever truly leaving. Across every era of human history, there are ideas that linger quietly at the edges of thought. They do not insist on themselves. They do not disrupt the rhythm of daily life. They simply remain in the background, steady and patient, drifting from one generation to the next as if carried by something that does not fade. One of those ideas is the possibility that the beings remembered in early stories never fully left the world. They may have stepped out of public view, allowing humans to guide their own development, but their presence may still persist gently in ways that never draw attention. This possibility does not appear in the loud moments of history. It lives instead in the quieter places, the places where memory blends with observation, where knowledge meets tradition, and where the edges of story and experience are not entirely separate. Throughout time, cultures across the world have kept fragments of memory that behave as though they were anchored to something real. These memories appear in myths describing wise strangers who visited at turning points, offering knowledge in simple words and then disappearing before anyone could ask where they came from. They appear in rituals that preserve older phrases few people understand, yet recite with care. They appear in symbols repeated across continents long before travel connected those continents. They appear in laws so refined that they seem borrowed from a deeper source rather than invented through trial and error. They appear in the quiet certainty some communities hold that their ancestors learned from visitors who live nearby but wish to remain unseen. These fragments do not act like inventions of imagination. They behave like memories of a relationship carried forward long after the details faded. A memory can continue through ritual, habit, and story, even when the original event lies far beyond reach. Over centuries, a memory can soften around the edges, becoming easier to carry. It loses its sharpness, but it does not disappear. It becomes something gentle, something reassuring. If the beings never left, these memories would reflect the last visible moments of their involvement, preserved in forms that survive because they ask so little of the people who carry them. The possibility that they remain here continues to whisper, because it aligns quietly with the pattern of human development. Early societies moved from scattered settlements to organized cities with surprising speed. Systems of measurement, irrigation, writing, and governance appear structured from the beginning. Myths describing early instruction match the archaeological record more closely than many expect. Stories of long-lived teachers match linguistic patterns that preserve words older than the societies using them. Architectural techniques that appear too advanced for their era match legends, describing guidance from individuals who understood how to build in harmony with stone and sky. This alignment does not claim certainty. It does not present itself as proof. It simply shows that the quiet possibility does not contradict what is known. It fits beside the evidence with a calm steadiness, neither asserting nor retreating, just inhabiting the space between explanation and memory. This is why the idea continues to whisper across ages. It does not need to be dramatic. It does not challenge the foundations of science or history. It simply rests in the places where knowledge meets wonder. In communities where oral tradition remains strong, the older stories are told not with fear or awe, but with familiarity. Elders describe the beings as wise, reserved, and patient. They are not depicted as rulers or conquerors. portrayed as neighbours who preferred calm interaction, who helped where necessary and stepped back when humans found their own way. These stories are told with the same tone used for distant relatives who moved away long ago but remain part of the family's memory. This tone reinforces a quiet truth. Memories that persist for thousands of years do so because they are woven into daily life, not because they demand attention. Even in places where traditions are no longer central to community identity, the idea still surfaces. It reappears in research that uncovers unexplained patterns. It reappears in studies of early development that encounter leaps difficult to explain through gradual change. It reappears in comparative mythology, when scholars notice structures shared across continents, despite the absence of contact. It reappears in linguistics when root terms refuse to align with known families. These fields rarely aim to support the possibility. Yet the patterns they reveal match what would be expected if a quiet civilization once taught early humans and then withdrew. The idea also persists because it offers a perspective on humanity that feels both grounding and comforting. If the beings never left, then humanity has never been fully alone in navigating the complexities of existence. This does not mean humans rely on them. The entire arc of human history demonstrates capacity, creativity, and resilience. But the possibility that another civilization remains nearby suggests that early humanity did not begin its journey without guidance. This guidance does not diminish human achievement, it enriches it. It suggests that humanity is part of a larger story, one defined by cooperation rather than conflict. This idea continues to whisper because it carries no demand. It does not insist on belief. It does not create fear. It simply suggests that the world may contain more continuity than people realize. The beings may have stepped into the background, maintaining their own lives while watching humanity grow. They may understand that silence is the most respectful way to honor the independence of a younger civilization. Their quiet presence would not alter the course of human events. It would only provide a steady backdrop to a world that sometimes feels unstable. In this way, the idea becomes a gentle reassurance rather than a disruption. There are places in the world where people still speak of remote valleys, high mountains, or deep forests where unusual individuals are said to live. These accounts are often described lightly, without emphasis on the extraordinary. The stories are told as if describing neighbours living beyond the ridge, people who rarely appear but are known to exist. The tone reflects familiarity rather than fear. It suggests that the idea of another civilization living quietly nearby is not strange to those communities. It is simply part of the landscape of memory. These stories continue because they do not require evidence. They require only the sense that the world has always contained layers beyond what is visible. In more analytical contexts, researchers examining early technological or linguistic anomalies occasionally pause when the patterns become too consistent to ignore. They notice that certain forms of knowledge appear suddenly and without obvious precursors. They recognize that some of humanity's earliest achievements reflect a level of refinement unusual for their time. These acknowledgements are often made cautiously, wrapped in careful language. Yet the recognition itself allows the whisper to continue. The possibility remains not only in story, but also in the steady work of understanding how human civilization emerged. Another reason this idea continues to drift through time is that it does not conflict with the rhythm of the natural world. Everything in nature changes slowly, steadily, and without spectacle. Rivers reshape landscapes gradually. Forests expand and recede in cycles. Species adapt over generations. If a long-lived civilization wished to avoid disrupting the natural flow of the world, it would choose silence, subtlety, and patience. It would not interfere with human development unless necessary. It would favour quiet adjustments over sweeping intervention. This approach aligns with what the myths describe. It aligns with the qualities attributed to the beings: calmness, restraint, and preference for teaching rather than domination. The modern world, with its constant noise, rapid change, and accelerating demands, might seem incompatible with the possibility of a hidden civilization. Yet it may be precisely this complexity that enables their continued existence. With so many distractions, so much information, and so much movement, people spend little time looking into the quiet spaces. Remote regions remain unexplored. Natural reserves remain untouched. Even in populated areas, many things pass unnoticed. A civilization accustomed to subtlety could move through this world without difficulty. Their choice to remain hidden would be easier now than at any time in the past. The whisper of this possibility also endures because it connects generations. It allows ancient stories to align with modern discoveries, creating a sense of continuity that humans rarely experience. People often sense that the world contains more depth than daily life reveals. They feel it in moments of stillness, when the world becomes quiet enough to notice subtle patterns. They feel it when encountering ancient structures that seem too precise for their age. They feel it when reading myths that describe interactions more practical than mystical. These moments create a gentle space for the possibility to exist, not as something proven or forced, but as something that feels quietly familiar. If the beings are still here, then their presence would shape human life in ways that are indirect but meaningful. They would observe the progress of technology, the shifting of cultures, and the rise of global networks with understanding rather than alarm. They would recognize humanity's growing ability to navigate complexity without guidance. Their continued withdrawal would reflect trust rather than distance. They would intervene only rarely, perhaps when knowledge risks being lost, or when stability depends on a subtle influence. These interventions would appear to humans as natural insight or unexpected timing. They would leave no trail. They would demand no recognition. The idea whispers across ages because it presents a different narrative of the world, one that contains collaboration rather than isolation, continuity rather than endings. It offers a perspective where civilizations can coexist without conflict, where knowledge can be shared without domination, and where guidance can be given without control. It suggests that the beings may have stepped back not because they abandoned humanity, but because they believed humanity could continue without them. This quiet possibility does not create tension. It creates calm. It allows the world to feel connected to something older than recorded history, something that does not seek attention or acknowledgement. The being's presence, if real, would be a background layer, steady and enduring. Their silence would not feel like absence. It would feel like patience. It would feel like a familiar presence choosing not to interrupt. As people move through the modern world, most of them never consider this possibility. Yet the idea remains, drifting gently through cultures, resurfacing in stories, appearing in unexpected places, and settling into the quiet corners of thought. It whispers because it does not need to be loud. It whispers because silence has always been its nature. It whispers because some part of humanity recognizes that the earliest teachers may still walk the world, unseen, carrying traditions older than cities, and watching the civilization they once guided move steadily forward. When viewed in this light, the idea becomes less a mystery and more a steady companion to the story of humanity. Its whisper continues because it reflects something people sense intuitively, that the world is shaped not only by what is visible, but also by what has chosen not to be seen. And in that calm recognition, the possibility finds a place to rest, continuing to drift quietly across ages, held by the same gentle thread that carried it through the earliest moments of human history, never demanding belief, never requiring proof, simply existing in the space between memory, evidence, and the soft understanding that some presences endure without needing to declare themselves.